The phenomena of sexual periodicity. The various physiological and psychological rhythms, menstruation, the alleged influence of the moon, frequent suppression of menstruation among primitive races, Mittelschmerz, possible tendency to a future intermenstrual cycle, menstruation among animals, menstruating monkeys and apes. What is menstruation? Its primary cause still obscure, the relation of menstruation to ovulation, the occasional absence of menstruation in health, the relation of menstruation to heat, the prohibition of intercourse. During menstruation, the predominance of sexual excitement at and around the menstrual period, its absence during the period frequently apparent only. Throughout the vegetable and animal worlds, the sexual functions are periodic. From the usually annual period of flowering in plants, with its play of sperm cell and germ cell and consequent seed production, through the varying sexual energies of animals, up to the monthly effervescence of the generative organism in woman, seeking not without the shedding of blood for the gratification of its reproductive function, from first to last we find unfailing evidence of the periodicity of sex. At first the sun, and then, as some have thought, the moon, have marked throughout a rhythmic impress on the phenomena of sex. To understand these phenomena we have not only to recognize the bare existence of that periodic fact, but to realize its implications. Rhythm, it is scarcely necessary to remark, is far from characterizing sexual activity alone. It is the character of all biological activity, alike on the physical and the psychic sides. All the organs of the body appear to be in a perpetual process of rhythmic contraction and expansion. The heart is rhythmic, so is the respiration. The spleen is rhythmic, so also the bladder. The uterus constantly undergoes regular rhythmic contractions at brief intervals. The vascular system, down to the smallest capillaries, is acted on by 3 series of vibrations, and every separate fragment of muscular tissue possesses rhythmic contractility. Growth itself is rhythmic, and, as Malling Hansen and subsequent observers have found, follows a regular annual course as well as a larger cycle. On the psychic sides, attention is rhythmic. We are always irresistibly compelled to impart a rhythm to every succession of sounds, however uniform and monotonous. A familiar example of this is the rhythm we can seldom refrain from hearing in the puffing of an engine. A series of experiments, by Bolton, on 30 subjects showed that the clicks of an electric telephone connected in an induction apparatus nearly always fell into rhythmic groups, usually of 2 or 4, rarely of 3 or 5, the rhythmic perception being accompanied by a strong impulse to make corresponding muscular movements. It is, however, with the influence, to some extent real, to some extent, perhaps, only apparent of cosmic rhythm that we are here concerned. The general tendency, physical and psychic, of nervous action to fall into rhythm is merely interesting from the present point of view as showing a biological predisposition to accept any periodicity that is habitually imposed upon the organism. Menstruation has always been associated with the lunar revolutions. Darwin, without specifically mentioning menstruation, has suggested that the explanation of the allied cycle of gestation in mammals, as well as incubation in birds, may be found in the condition under which ascidians live at high and low water in consequence of the phenomena of tidal change. It must, however, be remembered that the ascidian origin of the vertebrates has since been contested from many sides, and, even if we admit that at all events some such allied conditions in the early history of vertebrates and their ancestors tended to impress a lunar cycle on the race, it must still be remembered that the monthly periodicity of menstruation only becomes well marked in the human species. Bearing in mind the influence exerted on both the habits and the emotions even of animals by the brightness of moonlight nights, it is perhaps not extravagant to suppose that, on organisms already ancestrally predisposed to the influence of rhythm in general and of cosmic rhythm in particular, the periodically recurring full moon, not merely by its stimulation of the nervous system, but possibly by the special opportunities which it gave for the exercise of the sexual functions, served to implant a lunar rhythm on menstruation. How important such a factor may be we have evidence in the fact that the daily life of even the most civilized peoples is still regulated by a weekly cycle which is apparently a segment of the cosmic lunar cycle. Mantegazza has suggested that the sexual period became established with relation to the lunar period because moonlight nights were favorable to courting, and Nelson remarks that in his experience young and robust persons are subject to recurrent periods of wakefulness at night which they attribute to the action of the full moon. One may perhaps refer also to the tendency of bright moonlight to stir the emotions of the young, especially at puberty, a tendency which in neurotic persons may become almost morbid. It is interesting to point out that, the farther back we are able to trace the beginnings of culture, the more important we find the part played by the moon. Next to the alteration of day and night, the moon's changes are the most conspicuous and startling phenomena of nature. They first suggest a basis for reckoning time. They are of the greatest use in primitive agriculture, and everywhere the moon is held to have vast influence on the whole of organic life. Hahn has suggested that the reason why mythological systems do not usually present the moon in the supreme position which we should expect, is that its immense importance is so ancient a fact that it tends, with mythological development, to become overlaid by other elements. According to Saylor, Quetzalcoatl and Tezcatlipoca, the two most considerable figures in the Mexican pantheon, are to be regarded mainly as complementary forms of the moon divinity, and the moon was the chief Mexican measurer of time. 83. Even in Babylonia, where the sun was most specially revered, at the earliest period the moon ranked higher, being gradually superseded by the worship of the sun. Although such considerations as these will by no means take us as far back as the earliest appearance of menstruation, they may serve to indicate that the phases of the moon probably played a large part in the earliest evolution of man. With that statement we must at present rest content. It is possible that the monthly character of menstruation, while representing a general tendency of the human race, always and everywhere prevalent, may be modified in the future. It is a noteworthy fact that among many primitive races menstruation only occurs at long intervals. Thus among Eskimo women menstruation follows the peculiar cosmic conditions to which the people are subjected. Cook, the ethnologist of the Peary North Greenland expedition, found that menstruation only began after the age of 19, and that it was usually suppressed during the winter months. When there is no sun, only about 1 in 10 women continuing to menstruate during this period. It was stated by Velpo that Lapland and Greenland women usually only menstruate every 3 months, or even only 2 or 3 times during the year. On the Faroe Islands it is said that menstruation is frequently absent. Among the Samoyeds, Mantegazza mentions that menstruation is so slight that some travelers have denied its existence. Azara noted among the Guaranis of Paraguay that menstruation was not only slight in amount, but the periods were separated by long intervals. Among the Indians in North America, again, menstruation appears to be scanty. Thus, Holder, speaking of his experience with the Crow Indians of Montana, says, "I am quite sure that full-blood Indians in this latitude do not menstruate so freely as white women, not usually exceeding 3 days. Among the naked women of Tierra del Fuego, it is said that there is often no physical sign of the menses for 6 months at a time." These observations are noteworthy, though they clearly indicate, on the whole, that primitiveness in race is a very powerless factor without a cold climate. On the other hand, again, there is some reason to suppose that in Europe there is a latent tendency in some women for the menstrual cycle to split up further into 2 cycles, by the appearance of a latent minor climax in the middle of the monthly interval. I allude to the phenomenon usually called Mittelschmerz, middle period, or intermenstrual pain. Since the investigations of Goodman, Stevenson, Van Ott, Reinl, Jacobi, and others, it has been generally recognized that menstruation is a continuous process, the flow being merely the climax of a menstrual cycle, a physiological wave which is in constant flux or reflux. This cycle manifests itself in all a woman's activities, in metabolism, respiration, temperature, etc., as well as on the nervous and psychic side. The healthier the woman is, the less conscious is the cyclic return of her life, but the cycle may be traced, as Heger has found, even before puberty takes place, while Salerni has found that even in amenorrhea the menstrual cycle still manifests itself in the temperature and respiration. Revista Sperimentale di Freniatria, XXX, Fasc 2-3. For a summary of the phenomena of the menstrual cycle, See Havelock Ellis, Man and Woman, 4th ed., revised and enlarged, Chapter 11, The Functional Periodicity of Women. Compared to Keller, Archives Generales de Médecine, May, 1897, Heger, Allgemeine Zeitschrift für Psychiatrie, 1901, Heft 2 and 3, Helen McMurtry, Lancet, October 5. 1901, A. E. Giles, Transactions Obstetrical Society London, Volume 39, page 115, etc. Mittelschmerz is a condition of pain occurring about the middle of the intermenstrual period, either alone or accompanied by a slight sanguineous discharge, or, more frequently, a non-sanguineous discharge. In a case described by Van Voornveld, the manifestation was confined to a regularly occurring rise of temperature. The phenomenon varies, but seems usually to occur about the 14th day, and to last 2 or 3 days. Laycock, in 1840, Nervous Diseases of Women, page 46, gave instances of women with an intermenstrual period. De Paul and Guignet, Dictionnaire encyclopédique des sciences médicales, Art, Menstruation, page 694, speak of intermenstrual symptoms, and even actual flow, as occurring in women who are in a perfect state of health, and constituting genuine regals supernumeraries. The condition is, however, said to have been first fully described by Vallée, then, in 18725 by Sir William Priestley, and subsequently by Feeling, Farsbender, Sorrell, Halliday Croom, Findlay, Adinsell, and others. See, for instance, Mittelschmerz, by J. Halliday Croom. Transactions of Edinburgh Obstetrical Society, Volume 21, 1896. Also, Krieger, Menstruation, pp. 68-69. Fliess, Die Beziehungswischen Nes und weiblichen Geschlechtsorganen, page 118, goes so far as to assert that an intermenstrual period of menstrual symptoms, which he terms Nebenmenstruation, is a phenomenon well known to most healthy women. Observations are at present too few to allow any definite conclusions, and in some of the cases so far recorded a pathological condition of the sexual organs has been found to exist. Rossner, of Krakow, however, found that only in 1 case out of 12 was there any disease present, La Gynecology, June, 1905, and Storer, who has met with 20 cases, insists on the remarkable and definite regularity of the manifestations, wholly unlike those of neuralgia. Boston Medical and Surgical Journal, April 19, 1900. There is no agreement as to the cause of Mittelschmerz. Adinsell attributed it to disease of the fallopian tubes. This, however, is denied by such competent authorities as Cullingworth and Bland Sutton. Others, like Priestley, and subsequently Marsh. American Journal of Obstetrics, July, 1897, have sought to find the explanation in the occurrence of ovulation. This theory is, however, unsupported by facts, and eventually rests on the exploded belief that ovulation is the cause of menstruation. Rossner, following Richlet, vaguely attributes it to the diffused hyperemia which is generally present. Van der Velde also attributes it to an abnormal fall of vascular tone, causing passive congestion of the pelvic viscera. Others again, like Armand Routh and MacLean, in the course of an interesting discussion on Mittelschmerz. At the Obstetric Society of London, on the 2nd day of March, 1898, believe that we may trace here a double menstruation, and would explain the phenomenon by assuming that in certain cases there is an intermenstrual as well as a menstrual cycle. The question is not yet ripe for settlement, though it is fully evident that, looking broadly at the phenomena of rut and menstruation, the main basis of their increasing frequency as we rise toward civilized man is increase of nutrition, heat and sunlight being factors of nutrition. When dealing with civilized man, however, we are probably concerned not merely with general nutrition, but with the nervous direction of that nutrition. At this stage it is natural to inquire what the corresponding phenomena are among animals. Unfortunately, imperfect as is our comprehension of the human phenomena, our knowledge of the corresponding phenomena among animals is much more fragmentary and incomplete. Among most animals menstruation does not exist, being replaced by what is known as heat, or estrus, which usually occurs once or twice a year, in spring and in autumn, sometimes affecting the male as well as the female. There is, however, a great deal of progression in the upward march of the phenomena as we approach our own and allied zoological series. Heat in domesticated cows usually occurs every 3 weeks. The female hippopotamus in the zoological gardens has been observed to exhibit monthly sexual excitement, with swelling and secretion from the vulva. Progression is not only toward greater frequency with higher evolution or with increased domestication, but there is also a change in the character of the flow. As Wiltshire, in his remarkable lectures on the comparative physiology of menstruation, asserted as a law, the more highly evolved the animal, the more sanguineous the catamenial flow. It is not until we reach the monkeys that this character of the flow becomes well marked. Monthly sanguineous discharges have been observed among many monkeys. In the 17th century, various observers in many parts of the world, Bonius, Payer, Helbigus, van der Wiel, and others, noted menstruation in monkeys. Buffon observed it among various monkeys as well as in the orangutan. J.G. St. Hilaire and Cuvier, many years ago, declared that menstruation exists among a variety of monkeys and lower apes. Renger described a vaginal discharge in a species of cebus in Paraguay, while Raciborski observed in the Jardin des Plantes that the menstrual hemorrhage in ganones was so abundant that the floor of the cage was covered by it to a considerable extent. The same variety of monkey was observed at Suriname, by Hill, a surgeon in the Dutch army, who noted an abundant sanguineous flow occurring at every new moon, and lasting about 3 days, the animal at this time also showing signs of sexual excitement. The macaque and the baboon appear to be the non-human animals, in which menstruation has been most carefully observed. In the former, besides the flow, Bland Sutton remarks that all the naked or pale-colored parts of the body, such as the face, neck, and ischial regions, assume a lively pink color. In some cases, it is a vivid red. The flow is slight, but the coloring lasts several days, and in warm weather the labia are much swollen. Heap has most fully and carefully described menstruation in monkeys. He found at Calcutta that the Macacus cynomolgus menstruated regularly on the 20th of December, 20th of January, and about the 20th of February. The Cynocephalus porcaria and the Semnopithecus entellus both menstruated each month for about 4 days. In the Macachi rhesus and cynomolgus at menstruation the nipples and vulva become swollen and deeply congested, and the skin of the buttocks swollen, tense, and of a brilliant red or even purple color. The abdominal wall also, for a short space upward, and the inside of the thighs, sometimes as far down as the heel, and the undersurface of the tail for half its length or more, are all colored a vivid red, while the skin of the face, especially about the eyes, is flushed or blotched with red. In late gestation the coloring is still more vivid. Something similar is to be seen in the males also. Distant, who kept a female baboon for some time, has recorded the dates of menstruation during a year. He found that 9 periods occurred during the year. The average length between the periods was nearly 6 weeks, but they occurred more frequently in the late autumn and the winter than in the summer. It is an interesting fact, Heap noted, that, notwithstanding menstruation, the seasonal influence, or rut, still persisted in the monkeys he investigated. In the anthropoid apes, Hartmann remarks that several observers have recorded periodic menstruation in the chimpanzee, with flushing and enlargement of the external parts, and protrusion of the external lips, which are not usually visible, while there is often excessive enlargement and reddening of these parts and of the posterior callosities during sexual excitement. Very little, however, appears to be definitely known regarding any form of menstruation in the higher apes. M. Denneker, who has made a special study of the anthropoid apes, informs me that he has so far been unable to make definite observations regarding the existence of menstruation. Moll remarks that he received information regarding such a phenomenon in the orangutan. A pair of orangutans was kept in the Berlin Zoological Gardens some years ago, and the female was stated to have at intervals a menstrual flow resembling that of women, and during this period to refrain from sexual congress, which was otherwise usually exercised at regular intervals, at least every 2 or 3 days. Moll adds, however, that, while his informant is a reliable man, the length of time that has elapsed may have led him to make mistakes in details. Keith, in a paper read before the Zoological Society of London, has described menstruation in a chimpanzee. It occurred every 23rd or 24th day, and lasted for 3 days. The discharge was profuse, and first appeared in about the 9th or 10th year. What is menstruation? It is easy to describe it, by its obvious symptoms, as a monthly discharge of blood from the uterus, but nearly as much as that was known in the infancy of the world. When we seek to probe more intimately into the nature of menstruation, we are still baffled, not merely as regards its cause, but even as regards its precise mechanism. The primary cause of menstruation remains unexplained, the cause of menstruation remains as obscure as ever, so conclude two of the most thorough and cautious investigators into this subject. It is, however, widely accepted that the main cause of menstruation is a rhythmic contraction of the uterus, the result of a disappointed preparation for impregnation, a kind of miniature childbirth. This seems to be the most reasonable view of menstruation, i.e., as an abortion of a decidua. Burdach, according to Beard, was the first who described menstruation as an abortive parturition. The hypothesis, Marshall and Jolly conclude, that the entire proestrous process is of the nature of a preparation for the lodgment of the ovum is in accordance with the facts. Fortunately, since we are here primarily concerned with its psychological aspects, the precise biological cause and physiological nature of menstruation do not greatly concern us. There is, however, one point which of late years has been definitely determined, and which should not be passed without mention: the relation of menstruation to ovulation. It was once supposed that the maturation of an ovule in the ovaries was the necessary accompaniment, and even cause, of menstruation. We now know that ovulation proceeds throughout the whole of life, even before birth, and during gestation, and that removal of the ovaries by no means necessarily involves a cessation of menstruation. It has been shown that regular and even excessive menstruation may take place in the congenital absence of a trace of ovaries or fallopian tubes. On the other hand, a rudimentary state of the uterus, and a complete absence of menstruation, may exist with well-developed ovaries and normal ovulation. We must regard the uterus as to some extent an independent organ, and menstruation as a process which arose, no doubt, with the object, teleologically speaking, of cooperating more effectively with ovulation, but has become largely independent. It is sometimes stated that menstruation may be entirely absent in perfect health. Few cases of this condition have, however, been recorded with the detail necessary to prove the assertion. One such case was investigated by Dr. H. W. Mitchell, and described in a paper read to the New York County Medical Society, February 22, 1892, to be found in medical reprints. June, 1892. The subject was a young, unmarried woman, 24 years of age. She was born in Ireland, and, until her emigration, lived quietly at home with her parents. Being then 20 years of age, she left home and came to New York. Up to that time no signs of menstruation had appeared, and she had never heard that such a function existed. Soon after her arrival in New York, she obtained a situation as a waiting maid, and it was noticed, after a time, that she was not unwell at each month. Friends filled her ears with wild stories about the dreadful effects likely to follow the absence of menstruation. This worried her greatly, and as a consequence she became pale and anemic, with loss of flesh, appetite, and sleep, and a long train of imaginary nervous symptoms. She presented herself for treatment, and insisted upon a uterine examination. This revealed no pathological condition of her uterus. She was assured that she would not die, or become insane, nor a chronic invalid. In consequence, she soon forgot that she differed in any way from other girls. A course of chalybeate tonics, generous diet, and proper care of her general health soon restored her to her normal condition. After close observation for several years, she submitted to a thorough examination, although entirely free from any abnormal symptoms. The examination revealed the following physical condition: weight, 105 pounds, her weight before leaving Ireland was 130, girth of chest, 29.5 inches, girth of abdomen, 25 inches, girth of pelvis, 34.5 inches, girth of thigh, upper third, 20 inches, heart healthy, sounds and rhythm perfectly normal, pulse 76, lungs healthy, respiratory murmur clear and distinct over every part, respiration easy and 20 per minute. The mammae are well developed, firm and round, nipples small, no areola, her skin is soft, smooth and healthy, figure erect, plump and symmetrical, her bowels are regular, kidneys healthy. She has a good appetite, sleeps well, and in no particular shows any sign of ill health. The uterine examination reveals a short vagina and a small, round cervix uteri, rather less in size than the average, and projecting very slightly into the vaginal canal. Depth of uterus from os to fundus, 2¼ inches, is very nearly normal. No external sign of abnormal ovaries. She is a well-developed, healthy young woman, performing all her physiological functions naturally and regularly, except the single function of menstruation. No vicarious menstruation takes the place of the natural function, though she has been watched very closely during the past 2 years, nor the least periodical excitement. It is added that, though the clitoris is normal, the mons veneris is almost destitute of hair, and the labia rather undeveloped, while, as far as is known, sexual instincts and desire are entirely absent. These latter facts, I may add, would seem to suggest that, in spite of the health of the subject, there is yet some concealed lack of development of the sexual system, of congenital character. In a case recorded by Plant, Centralblatt für Gynäkologie, No. 9, 1896, summarized in the British Medical Journal, April 4, 1896, in which the internal sexual organs were almost wholly undeveloped, and menstruation absent, the labia were similarly undeveloped, and the pubic hair scanty, while the axillary hair was wholly absent, though that of the head was long and strong. We may now regard as purely academic the discussion formerly carried on as to whether menstruation is to be regarded as analogous to heat in female animals. For many centuries at least the resemblance has been sufficiently obvious. Raciborski and Pouchet, who first established the regular periodicity of ovulation in mammals, identified heat and menstruation. During the past century there was, notwithstanding, an occasional tendency to deny any real connection. No satisfactory grounds for this denial have, however, been brought forward. Lawson Tate, indeed, and more recently Beard, have stated that menstruation cannot be the period of heat, because women have a disinclination to the approach of the male at that time, but, as we shall see later, this statement is unfounded. An argument which might, indeed, be brought forward is the very remarkable fact that, while in animals the period of heat is the only period for sexual intercourse, among all human races, from the very lowest, the period of menstruation is the one period during which sexual intercourse is strictly prohibited, sometimes under severe penalties, even life itself. This, however, is a social, not a physiological, fact. Ploss and Bartels call attention to the curious contrast, in this respect, between heat and menstruation. The same authors also mention that in the Middle Ages, however, preachers found it necessary to warn their hearers against the sin of intercourse during the menstrual period. It may be added that Aquinas and many other early theologians held, not only that such intercourse was a deadly sin, but that it engendered leprous and monstrous children. Some later theologians, however, like Sanchez, argued that the Mosaic enactments, such as Leviticus, chapter XX, v. 18, no longer hold good. Modern theologians, in part influenced by the tolerant traditions of Ligori, and, in part, like D. Brain, Moechiology, pp. 275 et seq., informed by medical science, no longer prohibit intercourse during menstruation, or regard it as only a venial sin. We have here a remarkable, but not an isolated, example of the tendency of the human mind in its development to rebel against the claims of primitive nature. The whole of religion is a similar remolding of nature, a repression of natural impulses, an effort to turn them into new channels. Prohibition of intercourse during menstruation is a fundamental element of savage ritual, an element which is universal merely because the conditions which caused it are universal, and because, as is now beginning to be generally recognized, the causes of human psychic evolution are everywhere the same. A strictly analogous phenomenon, in the sexual sphere itself, is the opposed attitude in barbarism and civilization toward the sexual organs. Under barbaric conditions and among savages, when no magico-religious ideas intervene, the sexual organs are beautiful and pleasurable objects. Under modern conditions, this is not so. This difference of attitude is reflected in sculpture. In savage and barbaric carvings of human beings, the sexual organs of both sexes are often enormously exaggerated. This is true of the archaic European figures on which Salomon Reinach has thrown so much light, but in modern sculpture, from the time when it reached its perfection in Greece onward, the sexual regions in both men and women are systematically minimized. With advancing culture, as again we shall see later, there is a conflict of claims, and certain considerations are regarded as higher and more potent than merely natural claims. Nakedness is more natural than clothing, and on many grounds more desirable under the average circumstances of life, yet, everywhere, under the stress of what are regarded as higher considerations, there is a tendency for all races to add more and more to the burden of clothes. In the same way, it happens that the tendency of the female to sexual intercourse during menstruation has everywhere been overlaid by the ideas of a culture which has insisted on regarding menstruation as a supernatural phenomenon which, for the protection of everybody, must be strictly tabooed. This tendency is reinforced, and in high civilization replaced, by the claims of an aesthetic regard for concealment and reserve during this period. Such facts are significant for the early history of culture, but they must not blind us to the real analogy between heat and menstruation, an analogy or even identity which may be said to be accepted now by most careful investigators. If it is, perhaps, somewhat excessive to declare, with Johnston, that woman is the only animal in which rut is omnipresent, we must admit that the two groups of phenomena merge into or replace each other, that their object is identical, that they involve similar psychic conditions. Here, also, we see a striking example of the way in which women preserve a primitive phenomenon which earlier in the zoological series was common to both sexes, but which man has now lost. Heat and menstruation, with whatever difference of detail, are practically the same phenomenon. We cannot understand menstruation unless we bear this in mind. On the psychic side, the chief normal and primitive characteristic of the menstrual state is the more predominant presence of the sexual impulse. There are other mental and emotional signs of irritability and instability which tend to slightly impair complete mental integrity, and to render, in some unbalanced individuals, explosions of anger or depression, in rarer cases crime, more common. Winking Sad Smiley 107, but the heightening of the sexual impulse, languor, shyness, and caprice are the more human manifestations of an emotional state which in some of the lower female animals during heat may produce a state of fury. The actual period of the menstrual flow, at all events the first 2 or 3 days, does not, among European women, usually appear to show any heightening of sexual emotion. This heightening occurs usually a few days before, and especially during the latter part of the flow, and immediately after it ceases. I have, however, convinced myself by inquiry that this absence of sexual feeling during the height of the flow is, in large part, apparent only. No doubt, the onset of the flow, often producing a general depression of vitality, may tend directly to depress the emotions, which are heightened by the general emotional state and local congestion of the days immediately preceding. But among some women, at all events, who are normal and in good health, I find that the period of menstruation itself is covered by the period of the climax of sexual feeling. Thus, a married lady writes, "My feelings are always very strong, not only just before and after, but during the period, very unfortunately, as, of course, they cannot then be gratified, while a refined girl of 19, living a chaste life, without either coitus or masturbation, which she has never practiced, habitually feels very strong sexual excitement about the time of menstruation, and more especially during the period. This desire torments her life, prevents her from sleeping at these times, and she looks upon it as a kind of illness." I could quote many other similar and equally emphatic statements, and the fact that so cardinal a relationship of the sexual life of women should be ignored or denied by most writers on this matter, is a curious proof of the prevailing ignorance. To show any heightening of sexual emotion, 108, this heightening occurs usually a few days before, and especially during the latter part of the flow, and immediately after it ceases. 109. I have, however, convinced myself by inquiry that this absence of sexual feeling during the height of the flow is, in large part, apparent only. No doubt, the onset of the flow, often producing a general depression of vitality, may tend directly to depress the emotions, which are heightened by the general emotional state and local congestion of the days immediately preceding. But among some women, at all events, who are normal and in good health, I find that the period of menstruation itself is covered by the period of the climax of sexual feeling. Thus, a married lady writes, "My feelings are always very strong, not only just before and after, but during the period, very unfortunately, as, of course, they cannot then be gratified, while a refined girl of 19, living a chaste life, without either coitus or masturbation, which she has never practiced, habitually feels very strong sexual excitement about the time of menstruation, and more especially during the period. This desire torments her life, prevents her from sleeping at these times, and she looks upon it as a kind of illness." I could quote many other similar and equally emphatic statements, and the fact that so cardinal a relationship of the sexual life of women should be ignored or denied by most writers on this matter, is a curious proof of the prevailing ignorance. 111. This ignorance has been fostered by the fact that women often disguise even to themselves the real state of their feelings. One lady remarks that while she would be very ready for coitus during menstruation, the thought that it is impossible during that time makes her put the idea of it out of her mind. I have reason to think that this statement may be taken to represent the real feelings of very many women. The aversion to coitus is real, but it is often due, not to failure of sexual desire, but to the inhibitory action of powerful extraneous causes. The absence of active sexual desire in women during the height of the flow may thus be regarded as, in part, a physiological fact, following from the correspondence of the actual menstrual flow to the period of proestrum, and in part, a psychological fact due to the aesthetic repugnance to union when in such a condition, and to the unquestioned acceptance of the general belief that at such a period intercourse is out of the question. Some of the strongest factors of modesty, especially the fear of causing disgust and the sense of the demands of ceremonial ritual, would thus help to hold in check the sexual emotions during this period, and when, under the influence of insanity, these motives are in abeyance, the coincidence of sexual desire with the menstrual flow often becomes more obvious. It must be added that, especially among the lower social classes, the primitive belief of the savage that coitus during menstruation is bad for the man still persists. Ploss and Bartels mention that among the peasants in some parts of Germany, where it is believed that impregnation is impossible during menstruation, coitus at that time would be frequent were it not thought dangerous for the man. It has also been a common belief both in ancient and modern times that coitus during menstruation engenders monsters. Notwithstanding all the obstacles that are thus placed in the way of coitus during menstruation, there is nevertheless good reason to believe that the first coitus very frequently takes place at this point of least psychic resistance. When still a student, I was struck by the occurrence of cases in which seduction took place during the menstrual flow, though at that time they seemed to me inexplicable, except as evidencing brutality on the part of the seducer. Negrier, in the lying-in wards of the Hôtel Dieu at Angers, constantly found that the women from the country who came there pregnant as the result of a single coitus had been impregnated at or near the menstrual epoch, more especially when the period coincided with a feast day, as St. John's Day or Christmas. Whatever doubt may exist as to the most frequent state of the sexual emotions during the period of menstruation, there can be no doubt whatever that immediately before and immediately after, very commonly at both times, this varying slightly in different women, there is usually a marked heightening of actual desire. It is at this period, and sometimes during the menstrual flow, that masturbation may take place in women who at other times have no strong autoerotic impulse. The only women who do not show this heightening of sexual emotion seem to be those in whom sexual feelings have not yet been definitely called into consciousness, or the small minority, usually suffering from some disorder of sexual or general health, in whom there is a high degree of sexual anesthesia. The majority of authorities admit a heightening of sexual emotion before or after the menstrual crisis. C.e.g., Krafft-Ebing, who places it at the postmenstrual period, Psychopathia Sexualis, ENG translation of 10th edition, page 27. Adler states that sexual feeling is increased before, during, and after menstruation. Die mangelhafte Geschlechtsempfindung des Weibes, 1904, page 88. Kosmin, Senator and Kaminer, Health and Disease in Relation to Marriage, I. 249, advises intercourse just after menstruation, or even during the latter days of the flow, as the period when it is most needed. Guyot says that the 8 days after menstruation are the period of sexual desire in women, Breviaire de l'amour expérimental, page 144. Harry Campbell investigated the periodicity of sexual desire in healthy women of the working classes, in a series of cases, by inquiries made of their husbands who were patients at a London hospital. People of this class are not always skillful in observation, and the method adopted would permit many facts to pass unrecorded. It is, therefore, noteworthy that only in 1/3 of the cases had no connection between menstruation and sexual feeling been observed. In the other 2/3, sexual feeling was increased, either before, after, or during the flow, or at all of these times. The proportion of cases in which sexual feeling was increased before the flow, to those in which it was increased after, was as 3:2. H. Campbell. Nervous Organization of Men and Women, p. 203. Even this elementary fact of the sexual life has, however, been denied, and, strange to say, by 2 women doctors. Dr. Mary Putnam Jacoby, of New York, who furnished valuable contributions to the physiology of menstruation, wrote some years ago, in a paper on the theory of menstruation, in reference to the question of the connection between estrus and menstruation. Neither can any such rhythmical alternation of sexual instinct be demonstrated in women as would lead to the inference that the menstrual crisis was an expression of this, i.e., of estrus. Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, again, in her book on the human element in sex, asserts that the menstrual flow itself affords complete relief for the sexual feelings in women, like sexual emissions during sleep in men, and thus practically denies the prevalence of sexual desire in the immediately post-menstrual period, when, on such a theory, sexual feeling should be at its minimum. It is fair to add that Dr. Blackwell's opinion is merely the survival of a view which was widely held a century ago, when various writers, Bourdieu, Roussel, Duffier, J. Arnold, etc., as Icard has pointed out, regarded menstruation as a device of providence for safeguarding the virginity of women. 2. The question of a monthly sexual cycle in men, the earliest suggestions of a general physiological cycle in men, periodicity in disease, insanity, heart disease, etc., the alleged 23 days cycle, the physiological periodicity of seminal emissions during sleep, original observations, fortnightly and weekly rhythms. For some centuries, at least, inquisitive observers here and there have thought they found reason to believe that men, as well as women, present various signs of a menstrual physiological cycle. It would be possible to collect a number of opinions in favor of such a monthly physiological periodicity in men. Precise evidence, however, is, for the most part, lacking. Men have expended infinite ingenuity in establishing the remote rhythms of the solar system and the periodicity of comets. They have disdained to trouble about the simpler task of proving or disproving the cycles of their own organisms. It is over half a century since Laycock wrote that the scientific observation and treatment of disease are impossible without a knowledge of the mysterious revolutions continually taking place in the system, yet the task of summarizing the whole of our knowledge regarding these mysterious revolutions is even today no heavy one. As to the existence of a monthly cycle in the sexual instincts of men, with a single exception, I am not aware that any attempt has been made to bring forward definite evidence. A certain interest and novelty attaches, therefore, to the evidence I am able to produce, although that evidence will not suffice to settle the question finally. The great Italian physician, Sanctorius, who was in so many ways the precursor of our modern methods of physiological research by the means of instruments of precision, was the first, so far as I am aware, to suggest a monthly cycle of the organism in men. He had carefully studied the weight of the body with reference to the amount of excretions, and believed that a monthly increase in weight to the amount of 1 or 2 pounds occurred in men, followed by a critical discharge of urine, this crisis being preceded by feelings of heaviness and lassitude. Gall, another great initiator of modern views, likewise asserted a monthly cycle in men. He insisted that there is a monthly critical period, more marked in nervous people than in others, and that at this time the complexion becomes dull, the breath stronger, digestion more laborious, while there is sometimes disturbance of the urine, together with general malaise, in which the temper takes part. Ideas are formed with more difficulty, and there is a tendency to melancholy, with unusual irascibility and mental inertia, lasting a few days. More recently, Stevenson, who established the cyclical wave theory of menstruation, argued that it exists in men also, and is really a general law of vital energy. Sanctorius does not appear to have published the data on which his belief was founded. Keele, an English follower of Sanctorius, in his Medicina Statica Britannica, 1718, published a series of daily, morning and evening, bodyweights for the year, without referring to the question of a monthly cycle. A period of maximum weight is shown usually, by Keele's figures, to occur about once a month, but it is generally irregular, and cannot usually be shown to occur at definite intervals. Monthly discharges of blood from the sexual organs and other parts of the body in men have been recorded in ancient and modern times, and were treated of by the older medical writers as an affliction peculiar to men with a feminine system. Laycock, Nervous Diseases of Women, page 79. A summary of such cases will be found in Gould and Pyle, Anomalies and Curiosities of Medicine, 1897, pp. 27-28. Laycock, Lancet, 1842-43, volumes I and II, brought forward cases of monthly and fortnightly cycles in disease, and asserted the general principle that there are greater and less cycles of movements going on in the system, involving each other, and closely connected with the organization of the individual. He was inclined to accept lunar influence, and believed that the physiological cycle is made up of definite fractions and multiples of a period of 7 days, especially a unit of 3.5 days. Albrecht, a somewhat erratic zoologist, put forth the view a few years ago that there are menstrual periods in men, giving the following reasons. 1. Males are rudimentary females. 2. In all males of mammals, a rudimentary masculine uterus, Muller's ducts, still persists. 3. Totally hyperspadic male individuals menstruate, and believed that he had shown that in man there is a rudimentary menstruation consisting in an almost monthly periodic appearance, lasting for 3 or 4 days, of white corpuscles in the urine, anomalo. February, 1890. Dr. Campbell Clark, some years since, made observations on asylum attendants in regard to the temperature, during 5 weeks, which tended to show that the normal male temperature varies considerably within certain limits, and that so far as I have been able to observe, there is one marked and prolonged rise every month or 5 weeks, averaging 3 days, occasional lesser rises appearing irregularly and of shorter duration. These observations are only made in 3 cases, and I have no proof that they refer to the sexual appetite. Campbell Clark, The Sexual Reproductive Functions, Psychological Section, British Medical Association, Glasgow, 1888, also, Private Letters. Hammond, Treatise on Insanity, page 114, says, I have certainly noted in some of my friends the tendency to some monthly periodic abnormal manifestations. This may be in the form of a headache, or a nasal hemorrhage, or diarrhea, or abundant discharge of uric acid, or some other unusual occurrence. I think, he adds, this is much more common than is ordinarily supposed, and a careful examination or inquiry will generally, if not invariably, establish the existence of a periodicity of the character referred to. Dr. Harry Campbell, in his book on differences in the nervous organization of men and women, deals fully with the monthly rhythm, pp. 270 et seq., and devotes a short chapter to the question, is the menstrual rhythm peculiar to the female sex? He brings forward a few pathological cases indicating such a rhythm, but although he had written a letter to the Lancet, asking medical men to supply him with evidence bearing on this question, it can scarcely be said that he has brought forward much evidence of a convincing kind, and such as he has brought forward is purely pathological. He believes, however, that we may accept a monthly cycle in men. We may, he concludes, regard the human being, both male and female, as the subject of a monthly pulsation which begins with the beginning of life, and continues till death, menstruation being regarded as a function accidentally engrafted upon this primordial rhythm. It is not unreasonable to argue that the possibility of such a menstrual cycle is increased, if we can believe that in women, also, the menstrual cycle persists even when its outward manifestations no longer occur. Aetius said that menstrual changes take place during gestation. In more modern times, Buffon was of the same opinion. Laycock also maintained that menstrual changes take place during pregnancy. Nervous Diseases of Women, page 47. Fliess considers that it is certainly incorrect to assert that the menstrual process is arrested during pregnancy, and he refers to the frequency of monthly epistaxis and other nasal symptoms throughout this period. W. Fliess, Beziehungswischen Nas- und Geschlechtsorganen, pp. 44 et seq. Beard, who attaches importance to the persistence of a cyclical period in gestation, calls it the muffled striking of the clock. Harry Campbell, Causation of Disease, page 54, has found post-climacteric menstrual rhythm in a fair sprinkling of cases up to the age of 60. It is somewhat remarkable that, so far as I have observed, none of these authors refer to the possibility of any heightening of the sexual appetite at the monthly crisis which they believe to exist in men. This omission indicates that, as is suggested by the absence of definite statements on the matter of increase of sexual desire at menstruation, it was an ignored or unknown fact. Of recent years, however, many writers, especially alienists, have stated their conviction that sexual desire in men tends to be heightened at approximately monthly intervals, though they have not always been able to give definite evidence in support of their statements. Clouston, for instance, has frequently asserted this monthly periodic sexual heightening in men. In the article, Developmental Insanity, in Tuke's Psychological Dictionary, he refers to the periodic physiological heightening of the reproductive nisus, and, again, in an article on alternation, periodicity, and relapse in mental diseases, Edinburgh Medical Journal, July, 1882, he records the case of an insane gentleman, aged 49, who, for the past 26 years, has been subject to the most regularly occurring brain exaltation every 4 weeks, almost to a day. It sometimes passes off without becoming acutely maniacal, or even showing itself in outward acts. At other times it becomes so, and lasts for periods of from 1 to 4 weeks. It is always preceded by an uncomfortable feeling in the head, and pain in the back, mental hebetude, and slight depression. The nisus generativus is greatly increased, and he says that, if in that condition, he has full and free seminal emissions during sleep, the excitement passes off. If not, it goes on. A full dose of bromide or iodide of potassium often, but not always, has the effect of stopping the excitement, and a very long walk sometimes does the same. When the excitement gets to a height, it is always followed by about a week of stupid depression. In the same article Clouston remarks, I have for a long time been impressed with the relationship of the mental and bodily alternations and periodicities in insanity to the great physiological alternations and periodicities, and I have generally been led to the conclusion that they are the same in all essential respects, and only differ in degree of intensity or duration. By far the majority of the cases in women follow the law of the menstrual and sexual periodicity. The majority of the cases in men follow the law of the more irregular periodicities of the nisus generativus. In that sex, many of the cases in both sexes follow the seasonal periodicity, which perhaps in man is merely a reversion to the seasonal generative activities of the majority of the lower animals. He found that among 338 cases of insanity, chiefly mania and melancholia, 46% of females and 40% of males showed periodicity, diurnal, monthly, seasonal, or annual, and more marked in women than in men, and in mania than in melancholia, and adds, I found that the younger the patient, the greater is the tendency to periodic remission and relapse. The phenomenon finds its acme in the cases of pubescent and adolescent insanity. Connolly Norman, in the article Mania, Hysterical, Tuke's Psychological Dictionary, states that the activity of the sexual organs is probably in both sexes fundamentally periodic. Krafft-Ebing records the case of a neurasthenic Russian, aged 24, who experienced sexual desires of urologenic character, with fair regularity, every 4 weeks, psychopathia sexualis, and Knack mentions the case of a man who had nocturnal emissions at intervals of 4 weeks. Archiv für Criminal Anthropology, 1908, page 363, while Moll, Libido Sexualis, B.D. I, pp 621-623, recorded the case of a man, otherwise normal, who had attacks of homosexual feeling every 4 weeks, and Rohleder, Zeitschrift für Sexualwissenschaft, November, 1908, gives the case of an unmarried slightly neuropathic physician who for several days every 3 to 5 weeks, has attacks of almost satyriacal sexual excitement. Fear, whose attention was called to this point, from time to time noted the existence of sexual periodicity. Thus, in a case of general paralysis, attacks of continuous sexual excitement, with sleeplessness, occurred every 28 days. At other times, the patient, a man of 42, in the stage of dementia, slept well, and showed no signs of sexual excitation. Société de Biologie, October 6, 1900. In another case, of a man of sound heredity and good health till middle life, periodic sexual manifestations began from puberty, with localized genital congestion, erotic ideas, and copious urination, lasting for 2 or 3 days. These manifestations became menstrual, with a period of intermenstrual excitement appearing regularly, but never became intense. Between the age of 36 and 42, the intermenstrual crises gradually ceased. At about 45, the menstrual crises ceased. The periodic crises continued, however, with the sole manifestation of increased frequency of urination. Société de Biologie, July 23, 1904. In a third case, of sexual neurasthenia, Fear found that from puberty, onwards to middle life, there appeared, every 25 to 28 days, tenderness and swelling below the nipple, accompanied by slight sexual excitation and erotic dreams, lasting for 1 or 2 days. Revue de Médecine, March, 1905. It is in the domain of disease that the most strenuous and, on the whole, the most successful efforts have been made to discover a menstrual cycle in men. Such a field seems promising at the outset, for many morbid exaggerations or defects of the nervous system might be expected to emphasize, or to free from inhibition, fundamental rhythmical processes of the organism which in health, and under the varying conditions of social existence, are overlaid by the higher mental activities and the pressure of external stimuli. In the 18th century, Erasmus Darwin wrote a remarkable and interesting chapter on the periods of disease, dealing with solar and lunar influence on biological processes. Since then, many writers have brought forward evidence, especially in the domain of nervous and mental disease, which seems to justify a belief that, under pathological conditions, a tendency to a male menstrual rhythm may be clearly laid bare. We should expect an organ so primitive in character as the heart, and with so powerful a rhythm already stamped upon its nervous organization, to be peculiarly apt to display a menstrual rhythm under the stress of abnormal conditions. This expectation might be strengthened by the menstrual rhythm which Mr. Pericost has found reason to suspect in pulse frequency during health. I am able to present a case in which such a periodicity seems to be indicated. It is that of a gentleman who suffered severely for some years before his death from valvular disease of the heart, with a tendency to pulmonary congestion and attacks of cardiac asthma. His wife, a lady of great intelligence, kept notes of her husband's condition, and at last observed that there was a certain periodicity in the occurrence of the exacerbations. The periods were not quite regular, but show a curious tendency to recur at about 30 days interval, a few days before the end of every month. It was during one of these attacks that he finally died. There was also a tendency to minor attacks about 10 days after the major attacks. It is noteworthy that the subject showed a tendency to periodicity when in health, and once remarked laughingly before his illness, "I am just like a woman, always most excitable at a particular time of the month." Periodicity has been noted in various disorders of nervous character. Periodic insanity has long been known and studied, e.g., Pilch, Die periodischen Geisterstoringen, 1901, it is much commoner in women than in men. Periodicity has been observed in stammering, a 6-weekly period in one case, and notably in hemicrania or migraine, by Harry Campbell, Osler, etc. The periodicity of a case of hemicrania has been studied in detail by D. Fraser Harris, Edinburgh Medical Journal, July, 1902. But the cycle in these cases is not always, or even usually, of a menstrual type. It is now possible to turn to an investigation which, although of very limited extent, serves to place the question of a male menstrual cycle for the first time on a sound basis. If there is such a cycle analogous to menstruation in women, it must be a recurring period of nervous erethism, and it must be demonstrably accompanied by greater sexual activity. In the American Journal of Psychology for 1888, Mr. Julius Nelson, afterward professor of biology at the Rutgers College of Agriculture, New Brunswick, published a study of dreams in which he recorded the results of detailed observations of his dreams, and also of seminal emissions during sleep, by him termed gonekbol or ekbol, during a period of something over 2 years. Mr. Nelson found that both dreams and ekbols fell into a physiological cycle of 28 days. The climax of maximum dreaming, as determined by the number of words in the dream record, and the climax of maximum ekbol fell at the same point of the cycle, the ekbolic climax being more distinctly marked than the dream climax. The question of cyclic physiological changes is considerably complicated by our uncertainty regarding the precise length of the cycle we may expect to find. Nelson finds a 28-day cycle satisfactory. Pericost, as we shall see, accepts a strictly lunar cycle of 29.5 days. Fliess has argued that in both women and men, many physiological facts fall into a cycle of 23 days, which he calls male, the 28-day cycle being female. W. Fliess, Die Beziehungen zwischen Nes und weiblichen Geschlechtsorganen, 1897, pp. 113 et seq. Although Fliess brings forward a number of minutely observed cases, I cannot say that I am yet convinced of the reality of this 23-day cycle. It is somewhat curious, however, that at the same time as Fliess, though in apparent independence, and from a different point of view, another worker also suggested that there is a 23-day physiological cycle, John Beard, The Span of Gestation and the Cause of Birth. Janer, 1897. Beard approaches the question from the embryological standpoint, and argues that there is what he terms an ovulation unit of about 23.5 days, in the interval from the end of one menstruation to the beginning of the next. 2 ovulation units make up one critical unit, and the length of pregnancy, according to Beard, is always a multiple of the critical unit. In man, the gestation period amounts to 6 critical units. These attempts to prove a new physiological cycle deserve careful study and further investigation. The possibility of such a cycle should be borne in mind, but at present we are scarcely entitled to accept it. So far as I am aware, Professor Nelson's very interesting series of observations, which, for the first time, placed the question of a menstrual rhythm in men on a sound and workable basis, have not directly led to any further observations. I am, however, in possession of a much more extended series of ecbolic observations completed before Nelson's paper was published, although the results have only been calculated at a comparatively recent date. I now propose to present a summary of these observations, and consider how far they confirm Nelson's conclusions. These observations cover no less a period than 12 years, between the ages of 17 and 29, the subject, W.K., being a student, and afterward schoolmaster, leading, on the whole, a chaste life. The records were faithfully made throughout the whole of this long period. Here, if anywhere, should be material for the construction of a menstrual rhythm on an ecbolic basis. While the results are in many respects instructive, it can scarcely, perhaps, be said that they absolutely demonstrate a monthly cycle. When summed in a somewhat similar manner to that adopted by Nelson in his ecbolic observations, it is not difficult to regard the maximum, which is reached on the 19th to 21st days of the summit physiological month, as a real menstrual ecbolic climax, for no other 3 consecutive days at all approach these in number of ecbols, while there is a marked depression occurring 4 days earlier, on the 16th day of the month. If, however, we split up the curve by dividing the period of 12 years into two nearly equal periods, the earlier of about 7 years and the latter of about 4 years, and summate these separately, the two curves do not present any parallel as regards the menstrual cycle. It scarcely seems to me, therefore, that these curves present any convincing evidence in this case of a monthly ecbolic cycle, and, therefore, I refrain from reproducing them, although they seem to suggest such a cycle. Nor is there any reason to suppose that by adopting a different cycle of 30 days, or of 23 days, any more conclusive results would be obtained. It seems, however, when we look at these curves more closely, that they are not wholly without significance. If I am justified in concluding that they scarcely demonstrate a monthly cycle, it may certainly be added that they show a rudimentary tendency for the ecboles to fall into a fortnightly rhythm, and a very marked and unmistakable tendency to a weekly rhythm. The fortnightly rhythm is shown in the curve for the earlier period, but is somewhat disguised in the curve for the total period, because the first climax is spread over 2 days, the 7th and 8th of the month. If we readjust the curve for the total period by presenting the days in pairs, the fortnightly tendency is more clearly brought out, chart I. A more pronounced tendency still is traceable to a weekly rhythm. This is, indeed, the most unquestionable fact brought out by these curves. All the maxima occur on Saturday or Sunday, with the minima on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday. This very pronounced weekly rhythm will serve to swamp more or less completely any monthly rhythm on a 28-day basis. Although here probably seen in an exaggerated form, it is almost certainly a characteristic of the ecbolic curve generally. I have been told by several young men and women, especially those who work hard during the week, that Saturday, and especially Sunday afternoon, are periods when the thoughts spontaneously go in an erotic direction, and at this time there is a special tendency to masturbation or to spontaneous sexual excitement. It is on Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, according to Gary's tables, that the fewest suicides are committed, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, with, however, a partial fall on Wednesday, those on which most suicides are committed, so that there would appear to be an antagonism between sexual activity and the desire to throw off life. It also appears, in the reports of the Bavarian factory inspectors, that accidents in factories have a tendency to occur chiefly at the beginning of the week, and toward the end rather than in the middle. Even growth, as Fleischmann has shown in the case of children, tends to fall into weekly cycles. It is evident that the nervous system is profoundly affected by the social influences resulting from the weekly cycle. The analysis of this series of ecbolic curves may thus be said to recall the suggestion of Laycock, that the menstrual cycle is really made up of 4 weekly cycles, the periodic unit, according to Laycock, being 3½ days. I think it would, however, be more correct to say that the menstrual cycle, perhaps originally formed with reference to the influence of the moon on the sexual and social habits of men and other animals, tends to break up by a process of segmentation into fortnightly and weekly cycles. If we are justified in assuming that there is a male menstrual cycle, we must conclude that in such a case as that just analyzed, the weekly rhythm has become so marked as almost entirely to obliterate the larger monthly rhythm. However constituted, there seems little doubt that a physiological weekly cycle really exists. This was, indeed, very clearly indicated many years ago by the observations of Edward Smith, who showed that there are weekly rhythms in pulse, respiration, temperature, carbonic acid evolution, urea, and body weight, Sunday being the great day of repair and increase of weight. In an appendix to this volume I am able to present the results of another long series of observations of nocturnal ecbolic manifestations carried out by Mr. Pericost, who has elaborately calculated the results, and has convinced himself that on the basis of a strictly lunar month, thus abolishing the disturbing influence of the weekly rhythm, which in his case also appears, a real menstrual rhythm may be traced. It does not appear to me, however, even yet, that a final answer to the question whether a menstrual sexual rhythm occurs in men can be decisively given in the affirmative. That such a cycle will be proved in many cases seems to me highly probable, but before this can be decisively affirmed it is necessary that a much larger number of persons should be induced to carry out on themselves the simple, but protracted, series of observations that are required. Since the first edition of this volume appeared, numerous series of ecbolic records have reached me from different parts of the world. The most notable of these series comes from a professional man, of scientific training, who has for the past 6 years lived in different parts of India, where the record was kept. Though the record extends over nearly 6 years, there are 2 breaks in it, due to a visit to England, and to loss of interest. Both involuntary and voluntary discharges are included in the record. The involuntary discharges occurred during sleep, usually with an erotic dream, in which the subject invariably awaked and frequently made an effort to check the emission. The voluntary discharges in most cases commenced during sleep, or, in the half-waking state, deliberate masturbation, when fully awake, was comparatively rare. The proportion of involuntary to more or less voluntary ecboles was about 3 to 1. A third kind of sexual manifestation, of frequency intermediate between the other 2 forms, is also included, in which a high degree of erethism is induced during the half-waking state, culminating in an orgasm in which the power of preventing discharge has been artificially acquired. The subject, E.M., was 32 years of age when the record began. He belongs to a healthy family, and is himself physically sound, 5 feet 6 inches in height, but weight low, due to rickets in infancy. In early life he stammered badly, his temperament is emotional and self-conscious, while his work is unusually exacting, and he lives for most of the year in a very trying climate. As a boy he was very religious, and has always felt obliged to resist sexual vice to the utmost, though there have been occasional lapses. As regards lunar periodicity, E.M. has summed his results in a curve, after the same manner as Mr. Pericost, beginning with the new moon. The periods covered include 54 lunar months, and the total number of discharges is 176. The average frequency is about 3 per month of 28 days. The curve, for the most part, zigzags between a frequency of 4 and 9, but on the 24th day it falls to 1, and then rises uninterruptedly to a height of 11 on the 27th day, falling to 2 on the next day. Whether a really menstrual rhythm is thus indicated I do not undertake to decide, but I am inclined to agree with E.M. himself that there is no definite evidence of it. It looks to me, he writes, as if the only real rhythm, putting aside the annual cycle, will be found to be the average period between the ecboles, varying in different persons, but in my case, about 9 1/8 days. May not the ecbolic period in men be compared to the menstrual period in women, and be an example of the greater catabolic activity of men? There is the period of tumescence, and the ecbole constituting the detumescence. The weekend holiday would hasten the detumescence, but about every 3rd weekend there would tend to be delay to enable the system to get back into its regulation 9 or 10 days stride. This might possibly be the explanation of the curves. The recent emissions were nearly all involuntary during sleep. Age may have something to do with the change in character. EMS curves frequently show the influence of weekly periodicity, in the tendency to ecbole on Sunday, or sometimes on Saturday or Monday. In recent years there has been some tendency for this climax to be thrown towards the middle of the week, but, on the whole, Wednesday is the point of lowest frequency. In another case, the subject, A.N., who has spent nearly all his life in the state of Indiana, has kept a record of sexual manifestations between the ages of 30 and 34. The data, which cover 4 years, have not been sent to me in a form which enables the possibility of a monthly curve to be estimated, but A.N., who has himself arranged the data on a lunar monthly basis, considers that a monthly curve is thus revealed. My memoranda, he writes, show that discharges occur most frequently on the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd days after new moon. There is also another period on the 14th and 15th, which might indicate a semilunar rhythm. The days of minimum discharge are the 7th, 8th, 22nd, and 23rd. It may be added that the yearly average of ecbolic manifestations, varying between 50 and 55, comes out as 52, or exactly 1 per week. A weekly periodicity is very definitely shown by ANS data. Sunday once more stands at the head of the week as regards frequency, in this case very decisively. The figures are as follows. In another case which has reached me from the United States, the data are slighter, but deserve note, as the subject is a trained psychologist, and I quote the case in his own words. Here, it will be seen, there appears to be a tendency for the ecbolic cycle to cover a period of about 6 weeks. In this case, also, there is a tendency for the climax to occur about Saturday or Sunday. X is 38 years old, unmarried, fair health, pretty good heredity, university trained, and engaged in academic pursuits. He thinks he may have completed puberty at about 13, though he has no proof that he was in the full possession of his sex powers until he was 15 years 3 months old, when he had his first emission. His sex life has been normal. He masturbated somewhat when he slept with other boys, or men, during early manhood, but not to excess. During the autumn of 1889, when 28 years of age, he observed that at certain times he had an itching feeling about the testicles, that he felt slightly irritable, that the penis erected with the slightest provocation, and that this peculiar feeling usually passed away with a nightly emission. Indeed, so regular was the matter that he usually wore a loin garment at these times, to prevent the semen getting on the bedding. This peculiar feeling ordinarily continued for 2 or 3 days. He recalls at these times that he felt that he would like to wrestle with someone, for there seemed to be a muscular tension. These states returned with apparent regularity, and the intervals seemed to be about 6 weeks, though no effort was made to measure the periods until 1893. The following notes are taken from the diaries of X. Thursday, December 29, 1892. The peculiar feeling. This is the only entry. Thursday, February 9, 1893. The peculiar feeling. The diary notes that X awoke nights to find erections, and that the feeling continued until Sunday night following, when there was an emission. Friday, March 27, 1893. The peculiar feeling. The diary notes that there was an emission the next night, and that the feeling disappeared. Wednesday, May 3, 1893. The peculiar feeling. The diary notes that it continued until Saturday night, when X had sexual relations, and that it then disappeared. Wednesday, June 14, 1893. The peculiar feeling. The diary states that the next night X had an emission, and the disappearance of the feeling. Thursday, July 27, 1893. The peculiar feeling. The diary notes that it was apparent at about 3 o'clock that afternoon. That night at 10 o'clock, X had sexual intercourse, and the feeling was not noted the next day. Friday, September 8, 1893. The peculiar feeling. Continued until Tuesday, the 11th, and then disappeared. No sexual intercourse, and no nightly emission. Wednesday, October 25, 1893. The peculiar feeling. Continued until Saturday night, when there was a nightly emission. Saturday, December 9, 1893. The peculiar feeling. Continued until Monday night, when there was sexual relations. It will be noted that the intervals observed were of about 6 weeks' duration, excepting one, that from September to October, when it was nearly 7 weeks. These observations were not recorded after 1893. X thinks that in 1894 the intervals were longer, an opinion which is based on the fact that for a period of 6 months he had no sexual intercourse and no nightly emissions. The times during this 6 months when he had the peculiar feeling, the sensation was so slight as to be scarcely noted. In 1895, the feeling seemed more pronounced than ever before, and X thinks that it may have recurred as often as once a month. In 1896, 1897, and 1898, the intervals, he thinks, lengthened at times, he thought, wholly disappeared. During 1899, while they did not recur often, when they did come the sensation was pronounced, although the emission was less common. There was a peculiar heavy feeling about the testicles, and a marked tendency towards erection of the penis, especially at night time, while sleeping. X often awoke to find a tense erection. Moreover, these feelings usually continued a week. 1. In general, X is of the opinion that as he grows older these intervals lengthen, though this inference is not based on recorded data. 2. He notes that a discharge, through sexual intercourse or in sleep, invariably brings the peculiar feeling to a close for the time being. 3. He notes that sexual intercourse at the time stops it, but, when there has been sexual intercourse within a week or 10 days of the time, based upon the observations of 1893, that it had no tendency to check the feeling. In another case, that of F.C., an Irish farmer, born in Waterford, the data are still more meagre, though the periodicity is stated to be very pronounced. He is chaste, steady, with occasional lapses from strict sobriety, healthy and mentally normal, living a regular open-air life, far from the artificial stimuli of towns. The observations refer to a period when he was from 20 to 27 years of age. During this period, nocturnal emissions occurred at regular intervals of exactly a month. They were ushered in by fits of irritability and depression, and usually occurred in dreamless sleep. The discharges were abundant and physically weakening, but they relieved the psychic symptoms, though they occasioned mental distress, since F.C. is scrupulous in a religious sense, and also apprehensive of bad constitutional effects, the result of reading alarmist quack pamphlets. In another case known to me, a young man leading a chaste life, experienced crises of sexual excitement every 10 to 14 days, the crisis lasting for several days. Finally, an interesting contribution to this subject, suggested by this study, has been made and published in the Proceedings of the Amsterdam International Congress of Psychology in 1907 by the well-known Amsterdam neurologist and psychologist Dr. Lsam von Römer under the title Über das Verhältnis zwischen Mondalter und Sexualität. Von Römer's data are made up not of nocturnal involuntary emissions, but of the voluntary acts of sexual intercourse of an unmarried man during a period of 4 years. Von Römer believes that these, to a much greater extent than those of a married man, would be liable to periodic influence, if such exist. On making a curve of exact lunar length, similarly to pericost, he finds that there are, every month, 2 maxima and 2 minima, in a way that approximately resemble pericost's curve. The main point in von Römer's results is, however, the correspondence that he finds with the actual lunar phases. The chief maximum occurs at the time of the full moon, and the secondary maximum at the time of the new moon, the minima being at the first and fourth quarters. He hazards no theory in explanation of this coincidence, but insists on the need for further observations. It will be seen that ANS results, ante-page 117, seem in the main to correspond to von Römer's. 3. The annual sexual rhythm in animals in man, tendency of the sexual impulse to become heightened in spring and autumn, the prevalence of seasonal erotic festivals, the Feast of Fools, the Easter and Midsummer bonfires, the seasonal variations in birth rate, the causes of those variations. The typical conception rate curve for Europe, the seasonal periodicity of seminal emissions during sleep, original observations, spring and autumn, the chief periods of involuntary sexual excitement, the seasonal periodicity of rapes, of outbreaks among prisoners, the seasonal curves of insanity and suicide, the growth of children according to season, the annual curve of bread consumption in prisons, seasonal periodicity of scarlet fever, the underlying causes of these seasonal phenomena. That there are annual seasonal changes in the human organism, especially connected with the sexual function, is a statement that has been made by physiologists and others from time to time, and the statement has even reached the poets, who have frequently declared that spring is the season of love. Thus, 60 years ago, Laycock, an acute pioneer in the investigation of the working of the human organism, brought together, in a chapter on the periodic movements in the reproductive organs of woman, in his Nervous Diseases of Women, 1840, pp 61-70, much interesting evidence to show that the system undergoes changes about the vernal and autumnal equinoxes, and that these changes are largely sexual. Edward Smith, also a notable pioneer in this field of human periodicity, and, indeed, the first to make definite observations on a number of points bearing on it, sums up, in his remarkable book, Health and Disease as Influenced by Daily, Seasonal, and Other Cyclical Changes in the Human System, 1861, to the effect that season is a more powerful influence on the system than temperature or atmospheric pressure, In the early and middle parts of spring, every function of the body is in its highest degree of efficiency, while autumn is essentially a period of change from the minimum toward the maximum of vital conditions. He found that in April and May most carbonic acid is evolved, there being then a progressive diminution to September, and then a progressive increase. The respiratory rate also fell from a maximum in April to a minimum maintained at exactly the same level throughout August, September. October and November, spring was found to be the season of maximum, autumn of minimum, muscular power. Sensibility to tactile and temperature impressions was also greater in spring. Kulischer, studying the sexual customs of various human races, concluded that in primitive times, only at two special seasons, at spring and in harvest time, did pairing take place, and that, when pairing ceased to be strictly confined to these periods, its symbolical representation was still so confined, even among the civilized nations of Europe. He further argued that the physiological impulse was only felt at these periods. Kulischer, Die geschlechtliche Zuchtwahl bei den Menschen in der Urzeit, Zeitschrift für Ethnology, 1876, pp 152 and 157. Constein, über Prädilektierungszeiten bei Schwangerschaft, Archiv für Gynäkologie, 1879, also suggested that women sometimes only conceive at certain periods of the year. Wiltshire, who made various interesting observations regarding the physiology of menstruation, wrote, "Many years ago, I concluded that every woman had a law peculiar to herself, which governed the times of her bringing forth and conceiving, that she was more prone to bring forth at certain epochs than at others, and subsequent researches have established the accuracy of the forecast." He further stated his belief in a primordial seasonal aptitude for procreation, the impress of which still remains, and, to some extent, governs the breeding times of humanity. A. Wiltshire, Lectures on the Comparative Physiology of Menstruation, British Medical Journal, March, 1883, pp. 502, etc. Westermarck, in a chapter of his History of Human Marriage, dealing with the question of a human pairing season in primitive times, brings forward evidence showing that spring, or, rather, early summer, is the time for increase of the sexual instinct, and argues that this is a survival of an ancient pairing season. Spring, he points out, is a season of want, rather than abundance, for a frugivorous species, but when men took to herbs, roots, and animal food, spring became a time of abundance, and suitable for the birth of children. He thus considers that in man, as in lower animals, the times of conception are governed by the times most suitable for birth. Rosenstadt, as we shall see later, also believes that men today have inherited a physiological custom of procreating at a certain epoch, and he thus accounts for the seasonal changes in the birth rate. Heap, who also believes that at one period of its existence the human species had a special breeding season, follows Wiltshire in suggesting that there is some reason to believe that the human female is not always in a condition to breed. W. Heap, Menstruation and Ovulation of Macacus rhesus, Philosophical Transactions, 1897, id. The Sexual Season of Mammals, Quarterly Journal Microscopical Science, 1900. Except, however, in one important respect, with which we shall presently have to deal, few attempts have been made to demonstrate any annual organic sexual rhythm. The supposition of such annual cycle is usually little more than a deduction from the existence of the well-marked seasonal sexual rhythm in animals. Most of the higher animals breed only once or twice a year, and at such a period that the young are born when food is most plentiful. At other periods the female is incapable of breeding, and without sexual desires, while the male is either in the same condition or in a condition of latent sexuality. Under the influence of domestication, animals tend to lose the strict periodicity of the wild condition, and become apt for breeding at more frequent intervals. Thus among dogs in the wild state the bitch only experiences heat once a year, in the spring. Among domesticated dogs, there is not only the spring period of heat, early in the year, but also an autumn period, about 6 months later. The primitive period, however, remains the most important one, and the best litters of pups are said to be produced in the spring. The mare is in season in spring and summer, sheep take the ram in autumn. Many of the menstruating monkeys also, whether or not sexual desire is present throughout the year, only conceive in spring and in autumn. Almost any time of the year may be an animal's pairing season, this season being apparently in part determined by the economic conditions which will prevail at birth. While it is essential that animals should be born during the season of greatest abundance, it is equally essential that pairing, which involves great expenditure of energy, should also take place at a season of maximum physical vigor. As an example of the sexual history of an animal through the year, I may quote the following description, by Dr. A.W. Johnston, of the habits of the American deer. Our common American deer, in wintertime, is half-starved for lack of vegetation in the woods. The low temperature, snow, and ice make his conditions of life harder for lack of the proper amount of food, whereby he becomes an easier prey to carnivorous animals. He has difficulty even in preserving life. In spring he sheds his winter coat, and is provided with a suit of lighter hair, and, while this is going on, the male grows antlers for defense. The female about this time is far along in pregnancy, and when the antlers are fully grown she drops the fawn. When the fawns are dropped, vegetation is plentiful and lactation sets in. During this time the male is kept fully employed in getting food and guarding his more or less helpless family. As the season advances, the vegetation increases and the fawn begins to eat grass. When the summer heat commences, the little streams begin to dry up, and the animal once more has difficulty in supporting life because of the enervating heat, the effect of drought on the vegetation, and the distance which has to be traveled to get water. Therefore, fully 10 months in each year the deer has all he can do to live without extra exertion incident to rutting. Soon after the autumn rains commence, vegetation becomes more luxurious, the antlers of the male and new suits of hair for both are fully grown, heat of the summer is gone, food and drink are plentiful everywhere, the fawns are weaned, and both sexes are in the very finest condition. Then, and then only, in the whole year, comes the rut, which, to them as to most other animals, means an unwonted amount of physical exercise besides the everyday runs for life from their natural enemies, and an unusual amount of energy is used up. If a doe dislikes the attention of a special buck, miles of racing result. If jealous males meet, furious battles take place. The strain on both sexes could not possibly be endured at any other season of the year. With approach of cold weather, climatic deprivations and winter dangers commence and rut closes. In all wild animals, rut occurs only when the climatic and other conditions favor the highest physical development. This law holds good in all wild birds, for it is then only that they can stand the strain incident to lovemaking. The common American crow is a very good study. In the winter he travels around the rice fields of the South, leading a tramp's existence in a country foreign to him, and to which he goes only to escape the rigors of the northern climate. For several weeks in the spring he goes about the fields, gathering up the worms and grubs. After his long flight from the south he experiences several weeks of an almost ideal existence, his food is plentiful, he becomes strong and hearty, and then he turns to thoughts of love. In the pairing season he does more work than at any other time in the year, fantastic dances, racing and chasing after the females, and savage fights with rivals. He endures more than would be possible in his ordinary physical state. Then come the care of the young and the long flights for water and food during the drought of the summer. After the molt, autumn finds him once more in flock, and with the first frosts he is off again to the south. In the wild state, rut is the capstone of perfect physical condition. A.W. Johnston, The Relation of Menstruation to the Other Reproductive Functions. American Journal of Obstetrics, Volume XXI, 1895. Wiltshire, Lectures on the Comparative Physiology of Menstruation, British Medical Journal, March, 1888, and Westermarck, History of Human Marriage, Chapter 2, enumerate the pairing season of a number of different animals. With regard to the breeding seasons of monkeys, little seems to be positively known. Heap made special inquiries with reference to the 2 species whose sexual life he investigated. He was informed that Semnopithecus entellus breeds twice a year, in April and in October. He accepts Acheson's statement that the Macacus rhesus, in Simla, copulates in October, and adds that in the very different climate of the plains it appears to copulate in May. He concludes that the breeding season varies greatly in dependence on climate, but believes that the breeding season is always preserved, and that it affects the sexual aptitude of the male. He could not make his monkeys copulate during February or March, but is unable to say whether or not sexual intercourse is generally admitted outside the breeding season. He quotes the observation of Breschet that monkeys copulate during pregnancy. In primitive human races, we very frequently trace precisely the same influence of the seasonal impulse as may be witnessed in the higher animals, although among human races it does not always result that the children are born at the time of the greatest plenty, and on account of the development of human skill such a result is not necessary. Thus Dr. Cook found among the Eskimo that during the long winter nights the secretions are diminished, muscular power is weak, and the passions are depressed. Soon after the sun appears a kind of rut affects the young population. They tremble with the intensity of sexual passion, and for several weeks much of the time is taken up with courtship and love. Hence, the majority of the children are born 9 months later, when the 4 months of perpetual night are beginning. A marked seasonal periodicity of this kind is not confined to the Arctic regions. We may also find it in the tropics. In Cambodia, Mondia has found that twice a year, in April and September, men seem to experience a veritable rut, and will sometimes even kill women who resist them. These two periods, spring and autumn, the season for greeting the appearance of life and the season for reveling in its final fruition, seem to be everywhere throughout the world the most usual seasons for erotic festivals. In classical Greece and Rome, in India, among the Indians of North and South America, spring is the most usual season, while in Africa the yam harvest of autumn is the season chiefly selected. There are, of course, numerous exceptions to this rule, and it is common to find both seasons observed. Taking, indeed, a broad view of festivals throughout the world, we may say that there are 4 seasons when they are held: the winter solstice, when the days begin to lengthen and primitive man rejoices in the lengthening and seeks to assist it winking sad smiley; the vernal equinox, the period of germination and the return of life; the summer solstice, when the sun reaches its height; and autumn, the period of fruition, of thankfulness, and of repose. But it is rarely that we find a people seriously celebrating more than 2 of these festival seasons. In Australia, according to Muller as quoted by Ploss and Bartels, marriage and conception take place during the warm season, when there is greatest abundance of food, and to some extent is even confined to that period. Oldfield and others state that the Australian erotic festivals take place only in spring. Among some tribes, Muller adds, such as the Watshandis, conception is inaugurated by a festival called Karo, which takes place in the warm season at the first new moon after the yams are ripe. The leading feature of this festival is a moonlight dance, representing the sexual act symbolically. With their spears, regarded as the symbols of the male organ, the men attack bushes, which represent the female organs. They thus work themselves up to a state of extreme sexual excitement. Among the Papuans of New Guinea, also, according to Miklucho Macleay, conceptions chiefly occur at the end of harvest, and Guise describes the great annual festival of the year which takes place at the time of the yam and banana harvest, when the girls undergo a ceremony of initiation and marriages are effected. In Central Africa, says Sir H. H. Johnston, in his Central Africa, sexual orgies are seriously entered into at certain seasons of the year, but he neglects to mention what these seasons are. The people of New Britain, according to Weiser, as quoted by Ploss and Bartels, carefully guard their young girls from the young men. At certain times, however, a loud trumpet is blown in the evening, and the girls are then allowed to go away into the bush to mix freely with the young men. In ancient Peru, according to an account derived from a pastoral letter of Archbishop Villagomez of Lima, in December, when the fruit of the polte is ripe, a festival was held, preceded by a 5 days fast. During the festival, which lasted 6 days and 6 nights, men and women met together in a state of complete nudity at a certain spot among the gardens, and all raced toward a certain hill. Every man who caught up with a woman in the race was bound at once to have intercourse with her. Very instructive, from our present point of view, is the account given by Dalton of the festivals of the various Bengal races. Thus the Hos, a Kolarian tribe of Bengal, are a purely agricultural people, and the chief festival of the year with them is the Marf Para. It is held in the month of January, when the granaries are full of grain, and the people, to use their own expression, full of devilry. It is the festival of the harvest home, the termination of the year's toil, and is always held at full moon. The festival is a Saturnalia, when all rules of duty and decorum are forgotten, and the utmost liberty is allowed to women and girls, who become like bacchantes. The people believe that at this time both men and women become overcharged with vitality, and that a safety valve is absolutely necessary. The festival begins with a religious sacrifice made by the village priest or elders, and with prayers for the departed and for the vouchsafing of seasonable rain and good crops. The religious ceremonies over, the people give themselves up to feasting and to drinking the homemade beer, the preparation of which from fermented rice is one of a girl's chief accomplishments. The Ho population, wrote Dalton, are at other seasons quiet and reserved in manner, and in their demeanor toward women gentle and decorous. Even in their flirtations they never transcend the bounds of decency. The girls, though full of spirits and somewhat saucy, have innate notions of propriety that make them modest in demeanor, though devoid of all prudery, and of the obscene abuse, so frequently heard from the lips of common women in Bengal, they appear to have no knowledge. They are delicately sensitive under harsh language of any kind, and never use it to others, and since their adoption of clothing they are careful to drape themselves decently, as well as gracefully, but they throw all this aside during the Marf feast. Their nature appears to undergo a temporary change. Sons and daughters revile their parents in gross language, and parents their children. Men and women become almost like animals in the indulgence of their amorous propensities. They enact all that was ever portrayed by prurient artists in a bacchanalian festival or Pandine orgy, and as the light of the sun they adore, and the presence of numerous spectators, seems to be no restraint on their indulgence, it cannot be expected that chastity is preserved when the shades of night fall on such a scene of licentiousness and debauchery. While, however, thus representing the festival as a mere debauch, Dalton adds that relationships formed at this time generally end in marriage. There is also a flower festival in April and May, of religious nature, but the dances at this festival are quieter in character. In Burma, the great festival of the year is the full moon of October, following the Buddhist Lent season, which is also the wet season, during which there is no sexual intercourse. The other great festival is the New Year in March. In classical times, the great festivals were held at the same time as in northern and modern Europe. The Brumalia took place in midwinter, when the days were shortest, and the Rosolia, according to early custom in May or June, and at a later time about Easter. After the establishment of Christianity, the Church made constant efforts to suppress this latter festival, and it was referred to by an 8th century council as a wicked and reprehensible holiday-making. These festivals appear to be intimately associated with Dionysus worship, and the flower festival of Dionysus, as well as the Roman liberals in honor of Bacchus, was celebrated in March with worship of Priapus. The festivals of the Delian Apollo and of Artemis both took place during the first week in May, and the Roman Bacchanals in October. The medieval Feast of Fools was to a large extent a seasonal orgy licensed by the Church. It may be traced directly back through the barbataries of the Lower Empire to the Roman Saturnalia, and at Sens, the ancient ecclesiastical metropolis of France, it was held at about the same time as the Saturnalia, on the Feast of the Circumcision, i.e., New Year's Day. It was not, however, always held at this time. Thus at Evros it took place on the 1st of May, the Easter bonfires of northern Central Europe, the Midsummer, St. John's Eve, fires of southern Central Europe, still bear witness to the ancient festivals. There is certainly a connection between these bonfires and erotic festivals. It is noteworthy that they occur chiefly at the period of spring and early summer, which, on other grounds, is widely regarded as the time for the increase of the sexual instinct, while the less frequent period for the bonfires is that of the minor sexual climax. Manhard was perhaps the first to show how intimately these spring and early summer festivals, held with bonfires and dances and the music of violin, have been associated with lovemaking and the choice of a mate. In spring, the first Monday in Lent, Quadragesima, and Easter Eve were frequent days for such bonfires. In May, among the Franks of the Main, the unmarried women, naked and adorned with flowers, danced on the Blocksberg before the men, as described by Herbels in the 10th century. In the central highlands of Scotland, the Beltane fires were kindled on the 1st of May. Bonfires sometimes took place on Halloween, October 31st, and Christmas. But the great season all over Europe for these bonfires, then often held with erotic ceremonial, is the summer solstice, the 23rd of June, the eve of Midsummer, or St. John's Day. The Bohemians and other Slavonic races formerly had meetings with sexual license. This was so up to the beginning of the 16th century on the banks of rivers near Novgorod. The meetings took place, as a rule, the day before the festival of John the Baptist, which, in pagan times, was that of a divinity known by the name of Jarilo, equivalent to Priapus. Half a century later, a new ecclesiastical code sought to abolish every vestige of the early festivals held on Christmas Day, on the day of the baptism of our Lord, and on John the Baptist's Day. A general feature of all these festivals, says Kowalewski, was the prevalence of the promiscuous intercourse of the sexes. Among the Estonians, at the end of the 18th century, thousands of persons would gather around an old ruined church, in the Felenschen, on the eve of St. John, light a bonfire, and throw sacrificial gifts into it. Sterile women danced naked among the ruins, much eating and drinking went on, while the young men and maidens disappeared into the woods to do what they would. Festivals of this character still take place at the end of June in some districts. Young unmarried couples jump barefoot over large fires, usually near rivers or ponds. Licentiousness is rare, but in many parts of Russia the peasants still attach little value to virginity, and even prefer women who have been mothers. The population of the Grisons in the 16th century held regular meetings not less licentious than those of the Cossacks. These were abolished by law. Kowalewski regards all such customs as a survival of early forms of promiscuity. Fraser, Golden Bough, 2 ded. 1900, Volume 3, pp. 236-350, fully describes and discusses the dances, bonfires, and festivals of spring and summer, of Halloween, October 31st, and Christmas. He also explains the sexual character of these festivals. There are clear indications, he observes, page 305, that even human fecundity is supposed to be promoted by the genial heat of the fires. It is an Irish belief that a girl who jumps thrice over the midsummer bonfire will soon marry and become the mother of many children, and in various parts of France they think that if a girl dances round 9 fires she will be sure to marry within a year. On the other hand, in Lettrain, people say that if a young man and woman, leaping over the midsummer fire together, escape unsmirched, the young woman will not become a mother within 12 months, the flames have not touched and fertilized her. The rule observed in some parts of France and Belgium, that the bonfires on the first Sunday in Lent should be kindled by the person who was last married, seems to belong to the same class of ideas, whether it be that such a person is supposed to receive from, or impart to, the fire a generative and fertilizing influence. The common practice of lovers leaping over the fires hand in hand may very well have originated in a notion that thereby their marriage would be more likely to be blessed with offspring. And the scenes of profligacy which appear to have marked the midsummer celebration among the Estonians, as they once marked the celebration of May Day among ourselves, may have sprung, not from the mere license of holidaymakers, but from a crude notion that such orgies were justified, if not required, by some mysterious bond which linked the life of man to the courses of the heavens at the turning point of the year. As regards these primitive festivals, although the evidence is scattered and sometimes obscure, certain main conclusions clearly emerge. In early Europe there were, according to Grimm, only 2 seasons, sometimes regarded as spring and winter, sometimes as spring and autumn, and for mythical purposes these seasons were alone available. The appearance of each of these 2 seasons was inaugurated by festivals which were religious and often erotic in character. The Slavonic year began in March, at which time there was formerly, it is believed, a great festival, not only in Slavonic but also in Teutonic countries. In northern Germany there were Easter bonfires always associated with mountains or hills. The Celtic bonfires were held at the beginning of May, while the Teutonic May Day, or Walpurgisnacht, is a very ancient sacred festival, associated with erotic ceremonial, and regarded by Grimm as having a common origin with the Roman Floralia and the Greek Dionysia. Thus, in Europe, Grimm concludes, there are 4 different ways of welcoming summer. In Sweden and Gothland, a battle of winter and summer, a triumphal entry of the latter. In Schonen, Denmark, Lower Saxony, and England, simply May-riding, or fetching of the May-wagon. On the Rhine, merely a battle of winter and summer, without immersion, without the pomp of an entry. In Franconia, Thuringia, Meissen, Silesia, and Bohemia, only the carrying out of wintry death, no battle, no formal introduction of summer. Of these festivals, the first and second fall in May, the third and fourth in March. In the first 2, the whole population take part with unabated enthusiasm. In the last 2, only the lower, poorer class. Everything goes to prove that the approach of summer was to our forefathers a holy tide, welcomed by sacrifice, feast, and dance, and largely governing and brightening the people's life. The early spring festival of March, the festival of Ostara, the goddess of spring, has become identified with the Christian festival of resurrection, just as the summer solstice festival has been placed beneath the patronage of Saint John the Baptist, but there has been only an amalgamation of closely allied rites, for the Christian festival also may be traced back to a similar origin. Among the early Arabians, the Great Regab Feast, identified by Ewald and Robertson Smith with the Jewish Paschal Feast, fell in the spring or early summer, when the camels and other domestic animals brought forth their young and the shepherds offered their sacrifices. Babylonia, the supreme early center of religious and cosmological culture, presents a more decisive example of the sex festival. The festival of Tammuz is precisely analogous to the European festival of St. John's Day. Tammuz was the solar god of spring vegetation, and closely associated with Ishtar, also an agricultural deity of fertility. The Tammuz festival was, in the earliest times, held toward the summer solstice, at the time of the first wheat and barley harvest. In Babylonia, as in primitive Europe, there were only 2 seasons. The festival of Tammuz, coming at the end of winter and the beginning of summer, was a fast followed by a feast, a time of mourning for winter, of rejoicing for summer. It is part of the primitive function of sacred ritual to be symbolical of natural processes, a mysterious representation of natural processes with the object of bringing them about. The Tammuz festival was an appeal to the powers of nature to exhibit their generative functions. Its erotic character is indicated not only by the well-known fact that the priestesses of Ishtar, the Kardishtu, or holy ones, were prostitutes, but by the statements in Babylonian legends concerning the state of the earth during Ishtar's winter absence, when the bull, the ass, and man ceased to reproduce. It is evident that the return of spring, coincident with the Tammuz festival, was regarded as the period for the return of the reproductive instinct even in man, so that along this line also we are led back to a great procreative festival. Thus the great spring festivals were held between March and June, frequently culminating in a great orgy on Midsummer's Eve. The next great season of festivals in Europe was in autumn. The beginning of August was a great festival in Celtic lands, and the echoes of it, Rhys remarks, have not yet died out in Wales. The beginning of November, both in Celtic and Teutonic countries, was a period of bonfires. In Germanic countries especially there was a great festival at the time. The Germanic year began at Martinmas, November 11th, and the great festival of the year was then held. It is the oldest Germanic festival on record, and retained its importance even in the Middle Ages. There was feasting all night, and the cattle that were to be killed were devoted to the gods. The goose was associated with this festival. These autumn festivals culminated in the great festival of the winter solstice which we have perpetuated, in the celebrations of Christmas and New Year. Thus, while the 2 great primitive culminating festivals of spring and autumn correspond exactly, as we shall see, with the seasons of maximum fecundation, even in the Europe of today, the earliest spring, March, and though less closely autumn, November, festivals correspond with the periods of maximum spontaneous sexual disturbance, as far as I have been able to obtain precise evidence of such disturbance. That the maximum of physiological sexual excitement should tend to appear earlier than the maximum of fecundation is a result that might be expected. The considerations so far brought forward clearly indicate that among primitive races there are frequently 1 or 2 seasons in the year, especially spring and autumn, during which sexual intercourse is chiefly or even exclusively carried on, and they further indicate that these primitive customs persist to some extent even in Europe today. It would still remain to determine whether any such influence affects the whole mass of the civilized population and determines the times at which intercourse, or fecundation, most frequently takes place. This question can be most conveniently answered by studying the seasonal variation in the birth rate, calculating back to the time of conception. Wargentin, in Sweden, first called attention to the periodicity of the birth rate in 1767. The matter seems to have attracted little further attention until Quetelet, who instinctively scented unreclaimed fields of statistical investigation, showed that in Belgium and Holland there is a maximum of births in February, and, consequently, of conceptions in May, and a minimum of births about July, with consequent minimum of conceptions in October. Quetelet considered that the spring maximum of conceptions corresponded to an increase of vitality after the winter cold. He pointed out that this sexual climax was better marked in the country than in towns, and accounted for this by the consideration that in the country the winter cold is more keenly felt. Later, Woppers investigated the matter in various parts of northern and southern Europe as well as in Chile, and found that there was a maximum of conceptions in May and June attributable to season, and in Catholic countries strengthened by customs connected with ecclesiastical seasons. This maximum was, he found, followed by a minimum in September, October, and November, due to gradually increasing exhaustion and the influence of epidemic diseases, as well as the strain of harvest work. The minimum is reached in the south earlier than in the north. About November conceptions again become more frequent, and reach the second maximum at about Christmas and New Year. This second maximum is very slightly marked in southern countries, but strongly marked in northern countries. In Sweden the absolute maximum of conceptions is reached in December, and is due, in the opinion of Woppers, solely to social causes. Wilhelm reached somewhat similar results. Founding his study on 17 million births, he showed that in France it was in April, May, and June, or from the spring equinox to the summer solstice, and nearer to the solstice than the equinox, that the maximum of fecundations takes place, while the minimum of births is normally in July, but is retarded by a wet and cold summer in such a manner that in August there are scarcely more births than in July, and, on the other hand, a very hot summer, accelerating the minimum of births, causes it to fall in June instead of in July. He also showed that in Buenos Aires, where the seasons are reversed, the conception rate follows the reversed seasons, and is also raised by epochs of repose, of plentiful food, and of increased social life. Sormani studied the periodicity of conception in Italy, and found that the spring maximum in the southern provinces occurs in May, and gradually falls later as one proceeds northward, until, in the extreme north of the peninsula, it occurs in July. In southern Italy there is only one maximum and one minimum, in the north there are two. The minimum which follows the spring or summer maximum increases as we approach the south, while the minimum associated with the winter cold increases as we approach the north. Buchmann, who studied the matter in various parts of Germany, found that seasonal influence was specially marked in the case of illegitimate births. The maximum of conceptions of illegitimate children takes place in the spring and summer of Europe generally. In Russia it takes place in the autumn and winter, when the harvest working months for the population are over, and the period of rest, and also of minimum death rate, September, October, and November, comes round. In Russia the general conception rate has been studied by various investigators. Here the maximum number of conceptions is in winter, the minimum varying among different elements of the population. Looked at more closely, there are maxima of conceptions in Russia in January and in April. In Russian towns, however, the maximum number of conceptions occurs in the autumn. The special characteristics of the Russian conception rate are held to be due to the prevalence of marriages in autumn and winter, to the severely observed fasts of spring, and to the exhausting harvest work of summer. It is instructive to compare the conception rate of Europe with that of a non-European country. Such a comparison has been made by S. A. Hill for the northwest provinces of India. Here the Holi and other erotic festivals take place in spring, but spring is not the period when conceptions chiefly take place. Indeed, the prevalence of erotic festivals in spring appears to hill an argument in favor of those festivals having originated in a colder climate. The conceptions show a rise through October and November to a maximum in December and January, followed by a steady and prolonged fall to a minimum in September. This curve can be accounted for by climatic and economic conditions. September is near the end of the long and depressing hot season. When malarial influences are rapidly increasing to a maximum, the food supply is nearly exhausted, and there is the greatest tendency to suicide. With October, it forms the period of greatest mortality. December, on the other hand, is the month when food is most abundant, and it is also a very healthy month. For a summary of the chief researches into this question, see Ploss and Bartels, Das Weib. Also, Rosenstadt, Zur Frage nach den Ursachen welche die Zahl der Konzeptionen, etc., Mitteilungen aus den Embryologischen Institut Universität Wien. Second series, Fasc 4, 1890. Rosenstadt concludes that man has inherited from animal ancestors a physiological custom which has probably been further favored by climatic and social conditions. Primitive man, he proceeds, had inherited from his ancestors the faculty of only reproducing himself at determined epochs. On the arrival of this period of rut, fecundation took place on a large scale, this being very easy, thanks to the promiscuity in which primitive man lived. With the development of civilization, men give themselves up to sexual relations all the year around, but the physiological custom of procreating at a certain epoch has not completely disappeared. It remains as a survival of the animal condition, and manifests itself in the recrudescence of the number of conceptions during certain months of the year. O. Rosenbach, Bemerkungen über das Problem einer Brunstzeit beim Menschen. Archiv für Rassen und Gesellschaftsbiologie, BD 3, Heft 5, has also argued in favor of a chief sexual period in the year in man, with secondary and even tertiary climaxes, in March, August, and December. He finds that in some families, for several generations, birthdays tend to fall in the same months, but his paper is, on the whole, inconclusive. Some years ago, Professor J. B. Haycraft argued, on the basis of data furnished by Scotland, that the conception rate corresponds to the temperature curve. Haycraft, Physiological Results of Temperature Variation, Transactions of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, Volume 29, 1880. Temperature, he concluded, is the main factor regulating the variations in the number of conceptions which occur during the year. It increases their number with its elevation, and this on an average of 0.5%, for an elevation of 1 degree Fahrenheit. Whether or not this theory may fit the facts as regards Scotland, it is certainly altogether untenable when we take a broader view of the phenomena. Recently Dr. Paul Gaedeken of Copenhagen has argued in a detailed statistical study, La réaction de l'organisme sous l'influence physico-chimique des agents météorologiques, Archives d'Anthropologie Criminelle, February, 1909, that the conception rate, as well as the periodicity of suicide and allied phenomena, is due to the action of the chemical rays on the unpigmented skin in early spring, this action being physiologically similar to that of alcohol. He seeks thus to account for the marked and early occurrence of such periodic phenomena in Greenland and other northern countries where there is much chemical action, owing to the clear air, in early spring, but little heat. This explanation would not cover an autumnal climax, the existence of which Gaedeken denies. In order to obtain a fairly typical conception curve for Europe, and to allow the variations of local habit and custom to some extent to annihilate each other, I have summed the figures given by Mayer for about 250,000 births in Germany, France, and Italy, obtaining a curve, Chart 2, of the conception rate which may be said roughly to be that of Europe generally. If we begin at September as the lowest point, we find an autumn rise culminating in the lesser maximum of Christmas, followed by a minor depression in January and February. Then comes the great spring rise, culminating in May, and followed after June by a rapid descent to the minimum. In Canada, CEG, Report of the Registrar General of the Province of Ontario for 1904, the maximum and minimum of conceptions alike fall later than in Europe. The months of maximum conception are June, July, and August, of minimum conception, January, February, and March. June is the favorite month for marriage. It would be of some interest to know the conception curve for the well-to-do classes, who are largely free from the industrial and social influences which evidently, to a great extent, control the conception rate. It seems probable that the seasonal influence would here be specially well shown. The only attempt I have made in this direction is to examine a well-filled birthday book. The entries show a very high and equally maintained maximum of conceptions throughout April, May, and June, followed by a marked minimum during the next 3 months, and an autumn rise very strongly marked, in November. There is no December rise. As will be seen, there is here a fairly exact resemblance to the yearly ecbolic curve of people of the same class. The inquiry needs, however, to be extended to a very much larger number of cases. Mr. John Douglas Brown, of Philadelphia, has kindly prepared and sent me, since the above was written, a series of curves showing the annual periodicity of births among the educated classes in the state of Pennsylvania, using the statistics as to 4,066 births contained in the biographical catalogue of matriculates of the College of the University of Pennsylvania. Mr. Brown prepared 4 curves, the first, covering the earliest period, 1757 to 1859, the second, the period 1860 to 1876, the third, 1877 to 1893, while the fourth presented the summit results for the whole period. The dates named are those of the entry to classes, and not of actual occurrence of birth. A very definite and well-marked curve is shown, and the average number of births, not conceptions, per day, for the whole period, is as follows. There is thus a well-marked minimum of conceptions, a depression appearing here in each of the 3 periods, separately, about the month of July. In the second period, however, which contains the smallest number of births, the minimum occurs in September. From that low minimum there is steady and unbroken rise up to the chief maximum in November. In the first period, however, the maximum is delayed till January, and in the second period it is somewhat diffused. There is a tendency to a minor maximum in February, specially well marked in the third and most important period, and in the first period delayed until March. A very curious and perhaps not accidental coincidence might be briefly pointed out before we leave this part of the subject. It is found, by taking 3,000 cases of children dying under 1 year that, among the general population, children born in February and September, and therefore conceived in May and December, appear to possess the greatest vitality, and those born in June, and, therefore, conceived in September, the least vitality. As we have seen, May and December are precisely the periods when conceptions in Europe generally are at a maximum, and September is precisely the period when they are at a minimum, so that, if this coincidence is not accidental, the strongest children are conceived when there is the strongest tendency to procreate, and the feeblest children when that tendency is feeblest. Nelson, in his study of dreams and their relation to seasonal ecbolic manifestations, does not present any yearly ecbolic curve, as the 2 years and a half over which his observations extend scarcely supply a sufficient basis. On examining his figures, however, I find there is a certain amount of evidence of a yearly rhythm. There are spring and autumn climaxes throughout. In February and in November, there is no December rise. During 1 year there is a marked minimum from May to September, though it is but slightly traceable in the succeeding year. These figures are too uncertain to prove anything, but, as far as they go, they are in fair agreement with the much more extensive record, that of W.K. Ante. Page 113, which I have already made use of in discussing the question of a monthly rhythm. This record, covering nearly 12 years, shows a general tendency, when the year is divided into 4 periods, November-January, February-April, May-July, August-October, and the results summit, to rise steadily throughout, from the minimum in the winter period to the maximum in the autumn period. This steady upward progress is not seen in each year taken separately. In 3 years there is a fall in passing from the November-January to the February-April quarter, always followed by a rise in the subsequent quarter. In 3 cases there is a fall in passing from the second to the third quarter, again always followed by a rise in the following quarter, and in 2 successive years there is a fall in passing from the 3rd to the 4th quarter. If, however, beginning at the 2nd year, we summate the results for each year with those for all previous years, a steady rise from season to season is seen throughout. If we analyze the data according to the months of the year, still more precise and interesting results, as shown in the curve. Chart 3, are obtained. 2 maximum points are seen, one in spring, March, one in autumn, October, or, rather, August-October, and each of these maximum points is followed by a steep and sudden descent to the minimum points in April and in December. If we compare this result with pericosts also extending over a long series of years, we find a marked similarity. In both alike there are spring and autumn maxima, in both the autumn maximum is the highest, and in both also there is an intervening fall. In both cases, again, the maxima are followed by steep descents, but while in both the spring maximum occurs in March, in pericost's case the second maximum, though of precisely similar shape, occurs earlier, in June-September instead of August-October. In pericost's case, also, there is an apparently abnormal tendency, only shown in the more recent years of the record, to an additional maximum in January. The records certainly show far more points of agreement than of discrepancy, and by their harmony, as well with each other as with themselves, when the years are taken separately, certainly go far to prove that there is a very marked annual rhythm in the phenomena of seminal emissions during sleep, or, as Nelson has termed it, the ecbolic curve. We see, also, that the great yearly organic climax of sexual effervescence corresponds with the period following harvest, which, throughout the primitive world, has been a season of sexual erethism and orgy. Though those customs have died out of our waking lives, they are still imprinted on our nervous texture, and become manifest during sleep. The fresh records that have reached me since the first edition of this book was published show well-marked annual curves, though each curve always has some slight personal peculiarities of its own. The most interesting and significant is that of EM, see ante-page 116, covering 4 years. It is indicated by the following monthly frequencies, summate for the 4 years. EM lives in India. April, May, and June are hot months, but not unhealthy, and during this season, moreover, he lives in the hills, under favorable conditions, getting plenty of outdoor exercise. July, August, and September are nearly as hot, but much damper, and more trying. During these months, EM is living in the city, and his work is then also more exacting than at other times. September is the worst month of all. He has a short holiday at the end of it. During December, January, and February, the climate is very fine, and EM's work is easier. It will be seen that his ecbolic curve corresponds to his circumstances and environment, although until he analyzed the record he had no idea that any such relationship existed. Unfavorable climatic conditions and hard work, favorable conditions and lighter work, happen to coincide in his life, and the former depress the frequency of seminal emissions, the latter increase their frequency. At the same time, the curve is not out of harmony with the northern curves. There is what corresponds to a late spring, April, climax, and another still higher, late autumn, December, climax. A very interesting point is the general resemblance of the ecbolic curves to the Indian conception curves as set forth by Hill. Ante-page 140. The conception curve is at its lowest point in September, and at its highest point in December-January, and this ecbolic curve follows it, except that both the minimum and the maximum are reached a little earlier. When compared with the English annual ecbolic curves, WK and pericost, both spring and autumn maxima fall rather later, but all agree in representing the autumn rise as the chief climax. The annual curve of AN, ante-page 117, who lives in Indiana, USA, also covers 4 years. It presents the usual spring, May-June, in this case, and autumn, September-October, climaxes. The exact monthly results, summate for the 4 years, are given below. In order to allow for the irregular lengths of the months, I have reduced them to daily averages, for convenience treating the 4 years as 1 year. In his book on adolescence, Stanley Hall refers to 3 ecbolic records in his possession, all made by men who were doctors of philosophy, and all considering themselves normal. The best of these records, made by a virtuous, active, and able man, covered nearly 8 years. Stanley Hall thus summarizes the records, which are not presented in detail. The best of these records averages about 3.5 such experiences per month, the most frequent being 5.14 for July, and the least frequent 2.28 for September, for all the years taken together. There appears also a slight rise in April, and another in November, with a fall in December. The frequency varies in the different individuals. There was no tendency to a monthly cycle. In the best case, the minimum number for the year was 37, and the maximum, 50. 59% of all were at an interval of a week or less. 40% at an interval of from 1 to 4 days, 34% at an interval of from 8 to 17 days, the longest being 42 days. Poor condition, overwork, and undersleep led to infrequency. Early morning was the most common time. Normally there was a sense of distinct relief, but in low conditions, or with overfrequency, depression. G. S. Hall. Adolescence, Volume I, page 453. I may add that an anonymous article on nocturnal emissions, American Journal of Psychology, January, 1904, is evidently a fuller presentation of the first of Stanley Hall's 3 cases. It is the history of a healthy, unmarried, chaste man, who kept a record of his nocturnal emissions, and their accompanying dreams, from the age of 30 to 38. In what American state he lived is not mentioned. He was ignorant of the existence of any previous records. The yearly average was 37 to 50, remaining fairly constant. The monthly average was 3.43. I reproduced the total results summed for the months, separately, and I have worked out the daily average for each month, for convenience counting the summed 8 years as 1 year. Here, as in all the other curves we have been able to consider, we may see the usual 2 points of climax in spring and in autumn. The major climax covers April, May, June, and July. The minor autumnal climax is confined to November. In the light of the evidence which has thus accumulated, we may conclude that the existence of an annual ecbolic curve, with its spring and autumn climaxes, as described in the first edition of this book, is now definitely established. If we are to believe, as these records tend to show, that the nocturnal and involuntary voice of the sexual impulse usually speaks at least as loudly in autumn as in spring, we are confronted by a certain divergence of the sleeping sexual impulse from the waking sexual instinct, as witnessed by the conception curve, and also, it may be added, by the general voice of tradition, and, indeed, of individual feeling, which concur, on the whole, in placing the chief epoch of sexual activity in spring and early summer, more especially as regards women. It is not impossible to reconcile the contradiction, assuming it to be real, but I will refrain here from suggesting the various explanations which arise. We need a broader basis of facts. There are many facts to show that early spring and, to a certain extent, autumn are periods of visible excitement, mainly sexual in character. We have already seen that among the Eskimo menstruation and sexual desire occur chiefly in spring, but cases are known of healthy women in temperate climes who only menstruate twice a year, and in such cases the menstrual epochs appear to be usually in spring and autumn. Such, at all events, was the case in a girl of 20, whose history has been recorded by Dr. Mary Wenck, of Philadelphia. She menstruated first when 15 years old. 6 months later the flow again appeared for the second time, and lasted 3 weeks, without cessation. Since then, for 5 years, she menstruated during March and September only, each time for 3 weeks, the flow being profuse, but not exhaustingly so, without pain or systemic disturbance. Examination revealed perfectly normal uterus and ovarian organs. Treatment, accompanied by sitz baths during the time of month the flow should appear, accomplished nothing. The semi-annual flow continued and the girl seemed in excellent health. It is a remarkable fact that, as noted by Dr. Hamilton Wee at Elmira, sexual outbursts among prisoners appear to occur at about March and October. Beginning with the middle of February, writes Dr. Wee in a private letter, and continuing for about 2 months, is a season of ascending sexual wave, also the latter half of September and the month of October. We are now, March 30th, in the midst of a wave. According to Chinese medicine, it is the spring which awakens human passions. In early Greek tradition, spring and summer were noted as the time of greatest wantonness. In the season of toilsome summer, says Hesiod, Works and Days, 11, 569-90, the goats are fattest, wine is best, women most wanton, and men weakest. It was so, also, in the experience of the Romans. Pliny, Natural History, Book 12, Chapter XLAI, states that when the asparagus blooms and the cicada sings loudest, is the season when women are most amorous, but men least inclined to pleasure. Paulus E. Ginetta said that hysteria specially abounds during spring and autumn in lascivious girls and sterile women, while more recent observers have believed that hysteria is particularly difficult to treat in autumn. Oribasius, Synopsis. Lib I, Cap. 6, quotes from Rufus to the effect that sexual feeling is most strong in spring, and least so in summer. Rabelais said that it was in March that the sexual impulse is strongest, referring this to the early warmth of spring, and that August is the month least favorable to sexual activity. Pantagruel, Liv. V. Chapter 6. Nifo, in his book on love dedicated to Joan of Aragon, discussed the reasons why women are more lustful and amorous in summer, and men in winter. Vernet, in his Generation de l'Homme, harmonized somewhat conflicting statements with the observation that spring is the season of love for both men and women. In summer, women are more amorous than men. In autumn, men revive to some extent, but are still oppressed by the heat, which, sexually, has a less depressing effect on women. There is probably a real element of truth in this view, and both extremes of heat and cold may be regarded as unfavorable to masculine virility. It is highly probable that the well-recognized tendency of piles to become troublesome in spring and in autumn is due to increased sexual activity. Piles are favored by congestion, and sexual excitement is the most powerful cause of sudden congestion in the genitoanal region. Erasmus Darwin called attention to the tendency of piles to recur about the equinoxes. Zoonomia, section XXXVI, and since his days Gant, Bonavia, and Cullimore have correlated this periodicity with sexual activity. Laycock, quoting the opinions of some earlier authorities as to the prevalence of sexual feeling in spring, stated that that popular opinion appears to be founded on fact. Nervous Diseases of Women, page 69. I find that many people, and perhaps especially women, confirm from their own experience the statement that sexual feeling is strongest in spring and summer. Wickman states that pollutions are most common in spring, being perhaps the first to make that statement, and also nymphomania. In the 18th century, Schurig recorded a case of extreme and lifelong sexual desire in a woman whose salacity was always at its height towards the festival of St. John, Gynecologia. p. 16. A correspondent in the Argentine Republic writes to me that on big estancias, where we have a good many shepherds, nearly always married, or, rather, I should say, living with some woman, for our standard of morality is not very high in these parts, we always look out for trouble in springtime, as it is a very common thing at this season for wives to leave their husbands and go and live with some other man. A corresponding tendency has been noted even among children. Thus, Sanford Bell, The Emotion of Love Between the Sexes. American Journal Psychology, July, 1902, remarks, the season of the year seems to have its effect upon the intensity of the emotion of sex love among children. One teacher, from Texas, who furnished me with 76 cases, said that he had noticed that in the matter of love children seemed fairly to break out in the springtime. Many of the others who reported, incidentally mentioned the love affairs as beginning in the spring. This also agrees with my own observations. Crichton Brown remarks that children in springtime exhibit restlessness, excitability, perversity, and indisposition to exertion that are not displayed at other times. This condition, sometimes known as spring fever, has been studied in over 100 cases, both children and adults, by Klein. The majority of these report a feeling of tiredness, languor, lassitude, sometimes restlessness, sometimes drowsiness. There is often a feeling of suffocation, and a longing for nature and fresh air and daydreams, while work seems distasteful and unsatisfactory. Change is felt to be necessary at all costs, and sometimes there is a desire to begin some new plan of life. In both sexes there is frequently a wave of sexual emotion, a longing for love. Klein also found by examination of a very large number of cases that between the ages of 4 and 17 it is in spring that running away from home most often occurs. He suggests that this whole group of phenomena may be due to the shifting of the metabolic processes from the ordinary grooves into reproductive channels, and bring it into connection with the migrations of animals for reproductive purposes. It has long been known that the occurrence of insanity follows an annual curve, 163, and though our knowledge of this curve, being founded on the date of admissions to asylums, cannot be said to be quite precise, it fairly corresponds to the outbreaks of acute insanity. The curve presented in Chart 4 shows the admissions to the London County Council lunatic asylums during the years 1893 to 1897 inclusive. I have arranged it in 2-month periods, to neutralize unimportant oscillations. In order to show that this curve is not due to local or accidental circumstances, we may turn to France and take a special and chronic form of mental disease. Garnier, in his Folia Paris, presents an almost exactly similar curve of the admissions of cases of general paralysis to the Infirmerie Spéciale at Paris during the years 1886 to 88, Chart V. Both curves alike show a major climax in spring and a minor climax in autumn. Crime in general in temperate climates tends to reach its maximum at the beginning of the hot season, usually in June. Thus, in Belgium, the minimum is in February, the maximum in June, thence gradually diminishing. Lentz, Bulletin Société Médecine Mentale Belgique, March, 1901. In France, Lacassagne has summated the data extending over more than 40 years, and finds that for all crimes June is the maximum month, the minimum being reached in November. He also gives the figures for each class of crime separately, and every crime is found to have its own yearly curve. Poisonings show a chief maximum in May, with slow fall and a minor climax in December. Assassinations have a February and a November climax. Parricides culminate in May-June, and in October. Lacassagne's tables are given by Laurent, Les Habitués des Prisons de Paris, Chapter 1. Notwithstanding the general tendency for crime to reach its maximum in the first hot month, a tendency not necessarily due to the direct influence of heat, we also find, when we consider the statistics of crime generally, including sexual crime, that there is another tendency for minor climaxes in spring and autumn. Thus, in Italy, Penta, taking the statistics of nearly 4,000 crimes, murder, highway robbery, and sexual offenses, found the maximum in the first summer months, but there were also minor climaxes in spring and in August and September. Penta, Revista Mensale di Psichiatria, 1899. In nearly all Europe, as is shown by a diagram given by Lombroso and Lascaux, at the end of the first volume of Le Crime Politique. While the chief climaxes occur about July, there is, in most countries, a distinct tendency to spring, usually about March, and autumn, September and November, climaxes, though they rarely rise as high as the July climax. If we consider the separate periodicity of sexual offenses, we find that they follow the rule for crimes generally, and usually show a chief maximum in early summer. As Schaffenberg finds that the annual periodicity of the sexual impulse appears more strongly marked the more abnormal its manifestations, which he places in the following order of increasing periodicity: conceptions in marriage, conceptions out of marriage, offenses against decency, rape, assaults on children, Centralblatt für Nervenheilkunde. January, 1903. In France, rapes and offenses against modesty are most numerous in May, June, and July, as Villerme, Lacassagne, and others have shown. Villerme, investigating 1,000 such cases, found a gradual ascent in frequency, only slightly broken in March, to a maximum in June, oscillating between May and July, when the years are considered separately, and then a gradual descent to a minimum in December. Le Gludic gives, for the 159 cases he had investigated, a table showing a small February-March climax, and a large June-August maximum, the minimum being reached in November-January. Le Gludic. Attentats auxiliary moeurs, 1896, page 16. In Germany, Schaffenberg finds that sexual offenses begin to increase in March and April, reach a maximum in June or July, and fall to a minimum in winter. Monatsschrift für Psychiatry, 1903, Heft 2. In Italy, Penta shows that sexual offenses reach a minor climax in May, corresponding, in his experience, with the maximum for crimes generally, as well as with the maximum for conceptions, and a more marked climax in August-September. Penta, I Pervertimenti Sessuali, 1893, page 115, id. Rivista Mensile di Psichiatria, 1899. Core, in his Crime en Pays Creole, presents charts of the seasonal distribution of crime in Guadeloupe, with relation to temperature, which show that while, in a mild temperature like that of France and England, crime attains its maximum in the hot season, it is not so in a more tropical climate. In July, when in Guadeloupe the heat attains its maximum degree, crime of all kinds falls suddenly to a very low minimum. Even in the United States, where the summer heat is often excessive, it tends to produce a diminution of crime. Dexter, in an elaborate study of the relationship of conduct to the weather, shows that in the United States assaults present the maximum of frequency in April and October, with a decrease during the summer and the winter. The unusual and interesting fact demonstrated here with a certainty that cannot be doubted is, he concludes, that the unseasonably hot days of spring and autumn are the pugnacious ones, even though the actual heat be much less than for summer. We might infer from this that conditions of heat, up to a certain extent, are vitalizing, while, at the same time, irritating, but above that limit, heat is so devitalizing in its effects as to leave hardly energy enough to carry on a fight. E.g. Dexter, Conduct and the Weather, 1899, pp. 63 et seq. It is not impossible that the phenomena of seasonal periodicity in crimes may possess a real significance in relation to sexual periodicity. If, as is possible, the occurrence of spring and autumn climaxes of criminal activity is due less to any special exciting causes at these seasons than to the depressing influences of heat and cold in summer and winter, it may appear reasonable to ask whether the spring and autumn climaxes of sexual activity are not really also largely due to a like depressing influence of extreme temperatures at the other two seasons. Not only is there periodicity in criminal conduct, but even within the normal range of good and bad conduct seasonal periodicity may still be traced. In his Physical and Industrial Training of Criminals, H.D. Wee gives charts of the conduct of 7 prisoners during several years, as shown by the marks received. These charts show that there is a very decided tendency to good behavior during summer and winter, while in spring, February, March, and April, and in autumn, August, September, and October, there are very marked falls to bad conduct, each individual tending to adhere to a conduct curve of his own. Wee does not himself appear to have noticed this seasonal periodicity. Morrow, however, has investigated this question in Turin on a large scale and reaches results not very dissimilar from those shown by Wee's figures in New York. He noted the months in which over 4,000 punishments were inflicted on prisoners for assaults, insults, threatening language, etc., and shows the annual curve in Tavola 6 of his Caratteri dei Delinquenti. There is a marked and isolated climax in May. A still more sudden rise leads to the chief maximum of punishment in August, and from the minimum in October there is rapid ascent during the 2 following months to a climax much inferior to that of May. The seasonal periodicity of bad conduct in prisons is of interest as showing that we cannot account for psychic periodicity by invoking exclusively social causes. This theory of psychic periodicity has been seriously put forward, but has been investigated and dismissed, so far as crime in Holland is concerned, by J.R.B. de Roos, in the Transactions of the 6th Congress of Criminal Anthropology, at Turin, in 1906, Archivio di Psichiatria Fasc 3, 1906. The general statistics of suicides in continental Europe show a very regular and unbroken curve, attaining a maximum in June and a minimum in December, the curve rising steadily through the first 6 months, sinking steadily through the last 6 months, but always reaching a somewhat greater height in May than in July. Morsley shows that in various European countries there is always a rise in spring and in autumn, October or November. Morsley attributes these spring and autumn rises to the influence of the strain of the early heat and the early cold. In England, also, if we take a very large number of statistics, for instance, the figures for London during the 20 years between 1865 and 1884, as given by Ogle, in a paper read before the Statistical Society in 1886, we find that, although the general curve has the same maximum and minimum points, it is interrupted by a break on each side of the maximum, and these two breaks occur precisely at about March and October. This is shown in the curve in Chart 6, which presents the daily average for the different months. The growth of children follows an annual rhythm. Wall, the director of an educational establishment for homeless girls in Denmark, who investigated this question, found that the increase of weight for all the ages investigated was constantly about 33% greater in the summer half year than in the winter half year. It was noteworthy that even the children who had not reached school age and therefore could not be influenced by school life showed a similar, though slighter, difference in the same direction. It is, however, Malling Hansen, the director of an institution for deaf-mutes in Copenhagen, who has most thoroughly investigated this matter over a great many years. He finds that there are 3 periods of growth throughout the year, marked off in a fairly sharp manner, and that during each of these periods the growth in weight and height shows constant characteristics. From about the end of November up to about the end of March is a period when growth, both in height and weight, proceeds at a medium rate, reaching neither a maximum nor a minimum. Increase in weight is slight, the increase in height, although trifling, preponderating. After this follows a period during which the children show a marked increase in height, while increase in weight is reduced to a minimum. The children constantly lose in weight during this period of growth in height almost as much as they gain in the preceding period. This period lasts from March and April to July and August. Then follows the third period, which continues until November and December. During this period increase in height is very slight, being at its early minimum. Increase in weight, on the other hand, at the beginning of the period, in September and October, is rapid and to the middle of December very considerable, daily increase in weight being 3 times as great as during the winter months. Thus it may be said that the spring sexual climax corresponds, roughly, with growth in height and arrest of growth in weight, while the autumn climax corresponds roughly with a period of growth in weight and arrest of growth in height. Malling Hansen found that slight variations in the growth of the children were often dependent on changes in temperature, in such a way that a rise of temperature, even lasting for only a few days, caused an increase of growth, and a fall of temperature a decrease in growth. At Halle, Schmid-Monod found that nearly all growth in weight took place in the second half of the year, and that the holidays made little difference. In America, Peckham has shown that increase of growth is chiefly from the 1st of May to the 1st of September. Among young girls in St. Petersburg, Genchko found that increase in weight takes place in summer. Gopal found that increase in height takes place mostly during the first 8 months of the year, reaching a maximum in August, declining during the autumn and winter, in February being nil, while in March there is sometimes loss in weight even in healthy children. In the course of a study as to the consumption of bread in normal schools during each month of the year, as illustrating the relationship between intellectual work and nutrition, Binet presents a number of curves which bring out results to which he makes no allusion, as they are outside his own investigation. Almost without exception, these curves show that there is an increase in the consumption of bread in spring and in autumn, the spring rise being in February, March, and April, the autumn rise in October or November. There are, however, certain fallacies in dealing with institutions like normal schools, where the conditions are not perfectly regular throughout the year, owing to vacations, etc. It is, therefore, instructive to find that under the monotonous conditions of prison life precisely the same spring and autumn rises are found. Binet takes the consumption of bread in the women's prison at Claremont, where some 400 prisoners, chiefly between the ages of 30 and 40, are confined, and he presents 2 curves for the years 1895 and 1896. The curves for these 2 years show certain marked disagreements with each other, but both unite in presenting a distinct rise in April, preceded and followed by a fall, and both present a still more marked autumn rise, in one case in September and November, in the other case in October. Some years ago, Sir J. Crichton Browne stated that a manifestation of the sexual stimulus of spring is to be found in the large number of novels read during the month of March. Address in Psychology at the annual meeting of the British Medical Association, Leeds, 1889, Lancet, August 14, 1889. The statement was supported by figures furnished by lending libraries, and has since been widely copied. It would certainly be interesting if we could so simply show the connection between love and season, by proving that when the birds began to sing their notes, the young person's fancy naturally turns to brood over the pictures of mating in novels. I accordingly applied to Mr. Capel Shaw, Chief Librarian of the Birmingham Free Libraries, specially referred to by Sir J. Crichton Browne, who furnished me with the reports for 1896 and 1897–98, This latter report is carried on to the end of March, 1898. The readers who use the Birmingham Free Lending Libraries are about 30,000 in number. They consist very largely of young people between the ages of 14 and 25, somewhat less than half are women. Certainly, we seem to have here a good field for the determination of this question. The monthly figures for each of the 10 Birmingham libraries are given separately, and it is clear at a glance that without exception the maximum number of readers of prose fiction at all the libraries during 1897–98 is found in the month of March. I have chiefly taken into consideration the figures for 1897–98. The figures for 1896 are somewhat abnormal and irregular, probably owing to a decrease in readers, attributed to increased activity in trade, and partly to a disturbing influence caused by the opening of a large new library in the course of the year, suddenly increasing the number of readers, and drafting off borrowers from some of the other libraries. Not only so, but there is a second, or autumnal climax, almost equaling the spring climax, and occurring with equal certainty, appearing during 1897–98 either in October or November, and during 1896, constantly in October. Thus, the periodicity of the rate of consumption of prose fiction corresponds with the periodicity which is found to occur in the conception rate and in sexual ecbolic manifestations. It is necessary, however, to examine somewhat more closely the tables presented in these reports, and to compare the rate of the consumption of novels with that of other classes of literature. In the first place, if, instead of merely considering the consumption of novels per month, we make allowance for the varying length of the months, and consider the average daily consumption per month, the supremacy of March at once vanishes. February is really the month during which most novels were read during the first quarter of 1898, except at 2 libraries, where February and March are equal. The result is similar if we ascertain the daily averages for the first quarter in 1897, while, in 1896, which, however, as I have already remarked, is a rather abnormal year, the daily average for March in many of the libraries falls below that for January, as well as for February. Again, when we turn to the other classes of books, we find that this predominance which February possesses, and to some extent shares with March and January, by no means exclusively applies to novels. It is not only shared by both music and poetry, which would fit in well with the assumption of a sexual nisus, but the department of history, biography, voyages, and travels shares it also with considerable regularity. So, also, does that of arts, sciences, and natural history, and it is quite well marked in theology, moral philosophy, etc., and in juvenile literature. We even have to admit that the promptings of the sexual instinct bring an increased body of visitors to the reference library, where there are no novels, for here, also, both the spring and autumnal climaxes are quite distinct. Certainly this theory carries us a little too far. The main factor in producing this very marked annual periodicity seems to me to be wholly unconnected with the sexual impulse. The winter half of the year, from the beginning of October to the end of March, when outdoor life has lost its attractions, and much time must be spent in the house, is naturally the season for reading. But during the 2 central months of winter, December and January, the attraction of reading meets with a powerful counter-attraction in the excitement produced by the approach of Christmas, and the increased activity of social life which accompanies and for several weeks follows Christmas. In this way the other 4 winter months, October and November at the autumnal end, and February and March at the spring end, must inevitably present the 2 chief reading climaxes of the year, and so the reports of lending libraries present us with figures which show a striking, but fallacious, resemblance to the curves which are probably produced by more organic causes. I am far from wishing to deny that the impulse which draws young men and women to imaginative literature is unconnected with the obscure promptings of the sexual instinct. But, until the disturbing influence I have just pointed out is eliminated, I see no evidence here for any true seasonal periodicity. Possibly in prisons, the value of which, as laboratories of experimental psychology, we have scarcely yet begun to realize, more reliable evidence might be obtained, and those French and other prisons where novels are freely allowed to the prisoners might yield evidence as regards the consumption of fiction as instructive as that yielded at Claremont concerning the consumption of bread. Certain diseases show a very regular annual curve. This is notably the case with scarlet fever. Kager found in a London fever hospital a marked seasonal prevalence. There was a minor climax in May, repeated in July, and a great autumnal climax in October, falling to a minimum in December and January. This curve corresponds closely to that usually observed in London. It is not peculiar to London, or to urban districts, for in rural districts we find nearly the same spring minor maximum and major autumnal maximum. In Russia it is precisely the same. Many other epidemic diseases show very similar curves. An annual curve may be found in the expulsive force of the bladder as measured by the distance to which the urinary stream can be projected. This curve, as ascertained for one case, is interesting on account of the close relationship between sexual and vesical activity. After a minimum point in autumn, there is a rise through the early part of the year to a height maintained through spring and summer, and reaching its maximum in August. This may be said to correspond with the general tendency found in some cases of nocturnal seminal emissions from a winter minimum to an autumn maximum. There is an annual curve in voluntary muscle strength. Thus in Antwerp, where the scientific study of children is systematically carried out by a pedagogical bureau, Schouten found that, measured by the dynamometer, both at the ages of 8 and 9, both boys and girls showed a gradual increase of strength from October to January, a fall from January to March and a rise to June or July. March was the weakest month, June and July the strongest. Schouten also found an annual curve for mental ability, as tested by power of attention, which for much of the year corresponded to the curve of muscular strength, being high during the cold winter months. Lobsien, at Kiel, seeking to test Schouten's results and adopting a different method so as to gauge memory as well as attention, came to conclusions which confirmed those of Schouten. He found a very marked increase of ability in December and January, with a fall in April. April and May were the minimum months, while July and October also stood low. The inquiries of Schouten and Lobsien thus seem to indicate that the voluntary aptitudes of muscular and mental force in children reach their maximum at a time of the year when most of the more or less involuntary activities we have been considering show a minimum of energy. If this conclusion should be confirmed by more extended investigations, it would scarcely be matter for surprise and would involve no true contradiction. It would, indeed, be natural to suppose that the voluntary and regulated activities of the nervous system should work most efficiently at those periods when they are least exposed to organic and emotional disturbance. So persistent a disturbing element in spring and autumn suggests that some physiological conditions underlie it, and that there is a real metabolic disturbance at these times of the year. So few continuous observations have yet been made on the metabolic processes of the body that it is not easy to verify such a surmise with absolute precision. Edward Smith's investigations, so far as they go, support it, and Pericost's long-continued observations of pulse frequency seem to show with fair regularity a maximum in early spring and another maximum in late autumn. I may also note that Haig, who has devoted many years of observations to the phenomena of uric acid excretion, finds that uric acid tends to be highest in the spring months, March, April, May, and lowest at the first onset of cold in October. Thus, while the sexual climaxes of spring and autumn are rooted in animal procreative cycles which in man have found expression in primitive festivals, these, again, perhaps, strengthening and developing the sexual rhythm, they yet have a wider significance. They constitute one among many manifestations of spring and autumn physiological disturbance, corresponding with fair precision to the vernal and autumnal equinoxes. They resemble those periods of atmospheric tension, of storm and wind, which accompany the spring and autumn phases in the Earth's rhythm, and they may fairly be regarded as ultimately a physiological reaction to those cosmic influences.